The fire crackled softly, sending faint shadows dancing across the canyon walls. Beneath a sky drenched in stars, an elder sat cross-legged, her voice rising and falling like the wind threading through the desert. Her words weren't just sounds, they were life itself, each one charged with meaning, a thread connecting the living to their ancestors and to the land beneath them. The children sat transfixed, their small faces glowing in the firelight, listening not only with their ears, but with their souls. For the Navajo and Hopi people, the world isn't just a place to live, it is alive, breathing, and pulsing with unseen energy. Mountains rise not merely as geological formations, but as sacred beings with personalities, desires, and responsibilities. Rivers flow not just with water, but with stories carried from the past, murmuring truths about the interconnectedness of all things. Every plant, every stone, every breeze carries a purpose, a spirit that whispers its role in the grand design of existence. Long before the modern world began its feverish race toward progress, these people knew something that many have forgotten: life is not about dominating nature, but walking beside it. The Navajo, or Dine, speak of the holy people who brought balance to the chaos and gifted humanity with the tools to live in harmony. For the Hopi, the Kachinas, spiritual messengers, teach the importance of respect, humility, and maintaining the delicate order of the world. The Hopi tell of how their ancestors emerged from the depths of the earth, led by Spider Grandmother and other wise spirits. They ascended through worlds filled with trials, each one testing their integrity, compassion, and courage. Finally, they reached this world, the fourth world, where they were tasked to care for the earth and honor the spiritual forces that govern it. The stories carry weight, not as myths to entertain, but as truths to live by. In the quiet moments, when the sun stretches its first rays across the mesas, or when the wind howls with a voice ancient and mournful, these truths feel tangible. The land becomes a teacher, its lessons carved into red rocks and whispered through the soft sway of sagebrush. And in these lessons, one finds the sacred interconnection between the physical and the spiritual. But with this understanding comes a shadow, a recognition that imbalance invites chaos. The Navajo speak of Hazo, the concept of balance and beauty that governs a harmonious life. Yet, for every act of creation, there exists the potential for destruction. The elders whisper of those who choose to walk in darkness, who twist sacred teachings for selfish ends. It is said that such choices disrupt the harmony, casting long, jagged shadows over communities. To sit with these stories is to feel their weight pressing against your chest. They don't speak in abstracts, they echo with the footsteps of ancestors who lived and died by their lessons. The Hopi's reverence for their ceremonial dances, where the Kachinas are believed to manifest, isn't a quaint tradition, it is survival. The Navajo sand paintings, used for healing rituals, are not mere art but sacred maps to restore balance. Imagine standing at the edge of a canyon at dusk, the air electric with anticipation. The land feels alive, not as a metaphor but as a palpable truth. Somewhere in the vastness, a hawk cries out, its piercing call echoing like a warning. The stories linger here, embedded in the rocks and carried by the winds, waiting for those who will listen. For the Navajo and Hopi, to hear these stories is to become part of them. The act of listening is sacred, a reminder that humans are but one thread in a much larger tapestry. The stars above tell their own stories, each one a beacon of a lesson learned or a journey completed. Even the silence holds meaning, a pause between breaths that reminds one of the delicate balance between life and the forces that govern it. The elder's voice softens, her words trailing off like smoke into the night. The children blink, as if waking from a dream, their eyes wide with wonder and unease. They've been given a glimpse of something vast and ineffable, something that will linger in their hearts long after the fire dies down. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a silver glow over the desert landscape. The air was still, heavy with a quiet that felt unnatural, as if the earth itself held its breath. In the distance, a lone coyote howled, a long, mournful cry that sent a chill down the spine. The elders say that nights like this carry a warning, that the boundary between the seen and unseen grows thin. It is in these moments that the world feels fragile, as though the balance between light and darkness could tip with the slightest nudge. In Navajo and Hopi traditions, the world exists in a state of constant tension, a careful balance between forces of creation and destruction, good and evil. The land, the animals, the people, all are bound together in this delicate dance. To live well, one must honor this balance, walking the path of harmony. But there are those who stray, who choose a different way. They do not just disrupt the balance, they twist it, bending the sacred to their will. The stories of witchcraft are not told lightly. To speak of such things is to acknowledge their existence, and with acknowledgement comes power. Among the Navajo, the word antinini is spoken in hushed tones. It refers to witches, those who have turned away from the teachings of the holy people to embrace the darkness. For the Hopi, witchcraft is tied to betrayal, an act of defiance against the harmony that holds their world together. These are not simple tales of wrongdoing but profound warnings of what happens when the natural order is corrupted. In the firelight, the elder's voice trembles as she recounts a story passed down through generations. It begins with a healer, a man gifted with the power to mend the wounded and ease the suffering of his people. But envy took root in his heart. The praise and gratitude he received were not enough. He wanted more power, more control, more fear. And so, he turned to forbidden practices, offering prayers not to the holy people but to darker forces. His abilities grew, but so did the fear he instilled. Crops withered, livestock vanished, and whispers of his betrayal spread like wildfire. Witchcraft in these traditions is not simply a matter of personal gain. It is a deliberate choice to disrupt the harmony of the world. The Navajo speak of skinwalkers, witches who transform into animals to carry out their dark deeds. They wear the skins of these creatures, taking on their shapes and powers, moving unseen through the night. For the Hopi, witches are said to manipulate the unseen forces, using their knowledge of the spiritual world to harm others or bend them to their will. But witchcraft is not merely a force of destruction, it is also a test. It challenges communities to reaffirm their commitment to harmony and balance. When a sickness spreads through a village or misfortune strikes, the people gather, seeking answers through prayer and ceremony. They call on medicine men and women, whose role is to heal not just the body but the spirit. These healers confront the darkness head-on, risking their own well-being to restore order. The ceremonies are not just acts of resistance, they are acts of faith. The Navajo chant their prayers, creating intricate sand paintings that depict the story of creation. Each stroke of colored sand is a call to the holy people, asking for guidance and protection. The Hopi perform their sacred dances, the rhythms of their footsteps echoing through the canyon walls, summoning the Kachinas to intercede. These rituals are powerful, but they are also fragile, relying on the collective strength and belief of the community. There is a rawness to these tales, an honesty that strips away pretense. Witchcraft is not an abstract concept, but a very real threat, a reminder of the consequences of imbalance. The stories are filled with tension, moments of quiet dread when the air grows cold and the shadows seem to stretch farther than they should. They speak of betrayal, of the pain of seeing someone you once trusted turn against the community. They speak of resilience, of standing together in the face of fear, refusing to let darkness consume the light. The coyote's howl fades into silence, but the unease lingers. The fire burns lower, casting long shadows across the faces of those who listen. The elder pauses, her gaze distant, as if she can see beyond the flickering flames to something the others cannot. Her voice softens, but the weight of her words is heavier than ever. To live in balance is not just a choice, it is a responsibility. The land, the spirits, the ancestors, they are watching, waiting, hoping that the people will honor the harmony they fought so hard to create. The eagle soared high above the desert, its wings slicing through the air with effortless grace. From its perch in the sky, it could see everything, the winding canyons, the endless stretch of sagebrush, the quiet hum of life below. To the Navajo and Hopi, this was no ordinary bird. The eagle carried prayers to the heavens, a bridge between the people and the sacred forces that watched over them. Its sharp eyes and majestic flight were a reminder of clarity and vision, of seeing beyond the surface to the truth that lies beneath. In this world, animals are not just creatures, they are messengers, guides, and protectors. They carry lessons within their forms, each movement, call, and presence a whisper from the spiritual realm. To harm them carelessly is unthinkable, to honor them is to honor life itself. The coyote, with its sly grin and restless energy, is both trickster and teacher. In one story, it may outwit the arrogant, showing the dangers of pride. In another, it may bring chaos, forcing people to reflect on their choices and adapt to unforeseen challenges. When the coyote howls under the full moon, its voice seems to hold all the contradictions of existence, playful yet haunting, mischievous yet wise. The bear is power and protection, a symbol of strength that commands both respect and caution. When a bear appears, it is not random, it is an omen, a sign that something profound is at hand. The Navajo tell of the bear as a healer, its spirit guiding medicine men and women in their sacred work. The Hopi believe the bear embodies courage, standing firm against all odds, a reminder to face life's trials with unyielding resolve. And then there is the snake, a creature that slithers close to the earth, connecting deeply with the land. The snake is transformation, shedding its skin to reveal new life. For the Hopi, the snake plays a vital role in their ceremonies, its presence a call for rain and renewal. Watching it move is like witnessing the flow of life itself, unbroken and eternal. Every animal has its place, its story intertwined with the people and the land. The owl, with its haunting cry, is a harbinger of change, sometimes carrying warnings of death or misfortune. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, see into the shadows where others dare not look. To hear an owl in the stillness of the night is to feel the weight of the unknown pressing against your chest. The deer moves with a quiet grace, embodying gentleness and abundance. Its presence is a blessing, a sign of harmony and provision. The Navajo and Hopi treat the deer with utmost reverence, offering prayers and thanks before a hunt. Every part of the animal is used, nothing wasted, a testament to the sacred balance between giving and receiving. The stories of these animals are not just tales, they are woven into the fabric of everyday life. The eagle feather, carried with care, is a sacred object, used in ceremonies to call upon higher powers. The coyote's antics are told around the fire, laughter mingling with awe at its cleverness. The snake's path through the sand is watched with reverence, its patterns a message left for those who know how to read it. To the Navajo, animals are part of the hazo, the beauty and harmony of existence. They teach how to live, how to navigate the complexities of the world. The Hopi see animals as kachinas, spiritual beings that guide and protect, their forms both physical and symbolic. To walk among these creatures is to walk among sacred teachings, each one offering a piece of the puzzle that is life. The land is alive with their presence. A hawk circles overhead, its cry sharp and piercing, cutting through the quiet. A lizard scurries across a sun-baked rock, its movements quick and deliberate. Even the smallest creatures, the insects that hum and buzz, play their part, their existence a testament to the intricate web that binds all things together. There is a moment, standing under the vastness of the desert sky, when the truth of this connection becomes undeniable. The animals are not separate, they are kin, their lives echoing the struggles, joys, and lessons of humanity. To see an eagle dive, a coyote dash, or a deer pause and turn its head is to witness something profound, something that cannot be put into words, but only felt deep in the soul. The fire burns low, its light flickering against the shadows. The elder speaks of the time a bear appeared to a man in a dream, guiding him through a season of hardship. Her voice quivers as she describes the man's fear, his awe, and the unshakable strength he found in the bear's presence. The children listen with wide eyes, their breaths held, as though the bear might appear in the darkness beyond the firelight. This is how the lessons are passed, not through written words, but through stories, through the unbroken bond between the people and the animals that walk beside them. To see an animal is to see a reflection of oneself, a reminder of the balance, the beauty, and the sacred duty to live with respect and gratitude. The coyote howls again, its voice carrying through the stillness, and the desert seems to shiver with the weight of its call. The fire crackled in the stillness of the night, its glow casting long shadows across the faces gathered around it. An elder's voice cut through the quiet, low and measured, as if the very air demanded reverence for the words about to be spoken. There was a time, he began, his eyes catching the flicker of the flames, when a man could become a wolf. And not just in spirit, but in flesh and blood. The children shuddered, pulling their blankets tighter, while the adults exchanged wary glances. Everyone knew stories like these were not just tales, they carried warnings, truths woven into the fabric of their existence. The transformation was not a trick or illusion. It was a crossing over, a blurring of lines between what is human and what is something else entirely. Shapeshifting was no mere fantasy. It was power, raw and untamed, drawn from the very essence of the world. In the myths, it could be a gift, but more often, it was a curse. The wolf, the owl, the snake, they were not just animals but echoes of human desires, fears, and choices that carried weight beyond comprehension. One story spoke of a woman who loved the forest more than her own people. She spent her days wandering among the trees, speaking to them, hearing their secrets and the rustle of their leaves. The spirits, moved by her devotion, granted her the ability to transform into a doe, her limbs light and swift as she darted through the underbrush. But there was a cost. Though she could run free, her heart remained bound to her human form, torn between two worlds. Her people whispered of her appearances, glimpsed only at dusk, her eyes filled with both wonder and sorrow. Another tale told of a man consumed by anger, his spirit darkened by years of betrayal. The stories say he called upon forbidden forces, begging for vengeance. His wish was granted, but with it came a change. He was given the form of a great bear, his strength unmatched, his roar shaking the ground. Yet in this new body, his rage became unrelenting, his humanity slipping away with every attack on those he blamed for his pain. The bear man became a terror, stalking the villages, until one day, the spirits took pity and silenced his fury, leaving only the shadow of his legend behind. The transformation myths were never simple. They held layers of meaning, their symbols speaking to the deepest corners of the soul. To become another creature was to let go of oneself, to embrace the unknown in a way that could either bring enlightenment or destruction. It was about balance, how much one could endure before the scales tipped too far. The Hopi told of the Snake Clan, whose members were said to communicate with serpents. Their connection went beyond words, it was a merging of minds, an understanding of the snake's wisdom and its place in the cycle of life. Some say their ceremonies were so powerful that they could call forth rain, the snakes acting as intermediaries between the people and the heavens. But others whispered that a few among them could take the form of snakes, slithering into places no human could go, their movements both mesmerizing and chilling. Then there was the Skinwalker, a figure whose name carried fear even in the boldest hearts. A person who could wear the skin of an animal, becoming that creature in every way, eyes, claws, instincts. The transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual, a merging with the animal's essence that demanded sacrifice. To gain such power often required acts too dark to speak aloud, and those who sought it walked a line so thin it was almost invisible. The stories of skinwalkers spoke of both awe and dread. They were said to move with unnatural speed, their human cries blending with animal sounds that echoed through the canyons. Hunters who crossed their paths would return with eyes wide and mouths sealed, their silence more telling than any words. To see a skinwalker was to glimpse something forbidden, a reminder that not all power is meant to be claimed. Transformation myths were also about survival. In one tale, a boy lost in the wilderness called out to the spirits for help. Weak and starving, he begged for the strength to make it through the cold night. In answer, a great owl descended from the darkness, its wings wrapping around him. When morning came, the boy was gone, but a lone owl sat on the branch of a tree, its eyes shining with an understanding far beyond that of any bird. These stories were not only about individuals, but the connection between humanity and the natural world. They spoke of respect and caution, of recognizing that power is not something to be taken lightly. The transformation was not just about becoming something else, it was about understanding the cost of that change, the loss and gain that came with it. Even now, when the world seems to move further away from the old ways, these tales hold their grip. They are told in whispers, in songs, in the quiet moments when the wind carries a certain chill. They are reminders of a time when the lines between human and animal, spirit and flesh, were not so firmly drawn. The elder's voice grew softer as he spoke of the coyote, a creature that could change its shape at will. Some said it was a trick, a game played to outwit its enemies. Others believed it was a lesson, showing how adaptability could be the key to survival. But those who had seen it, truly seen it, knew it was something more. The coyote's eyes held a spark, a knowing that went beyond the boundaries of the physical world. As the fire burned lower, the stories seemed to linger in the air, each word a thread in the tapestry of their meaning. The faces around the fire reflected the flickering light, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. The myths were not just stories, they were warnings, teachings, and reflections of the human spirit's capacity for change. To hear them was to feel the weight of transformation pressing against the skin, the whisper of something ancient calling from the shadows. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the jagged rocks and dry earth of the desert. The air was thick, unnervingly still, and the only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the sagebrush. Then, from somewhere unseen, came a sound, a sharp, guttural cry that wasn't quite human. It carried a weight that made the blood run cold, a sound that whispered of things better left unseen. In the Navajo language, this was a name spoken softly, if at all. A being feared and despised, one whose very existence seemed to bend the boundaries of what was natural. The Skinwalker. The stories speak of them not as ordinary witches or shamans, but as something darker, something that twisted the sacred teachings into a weapon of terror. The origins of these myths are rooted in pain, betrayal, and a hunger for power that defied the balance of life. Long ago, there were those who turned their backs on harmony, seeking not to heal but to harm, not to guide but to control. They were said to begin as healers, those entrusted with the sacred knowledge of life and spirit. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Perhaps it was envy, or anger, or a thirst for power that could not be sated. Whatever the cause, they stepped away from the path of light and into shadow, performing acts so unspeakable that even the spirits turned away. The transformation was not a gift, it was a curse. The Skinwalker myths are full of this duality, power that comes with a price too high to bear. To become a skinwalker, the stories say, one must commit the unthinkable, an act of betrayal so vile it severs the soul from its humanity. Some say it was the taking of a life, not in defense or desperation, but as a deliberate offering to darkness. The blood spilled would forever stain the hands of the one who sought this forbidden path. Once the line was crossed, the change began. The Skinwalker gained the ability to take on the form of any animal it desired, wolf, crow, fox, or something more sinister. But these forms were not perfect, they were grotesque reflections of the real thing, twisted and unnatural, with eyes that gleamed too brightly, movements that seemed too smooth or too jagged. They were creatures of nightmare, uncanny in their mimicry. The Skinwalker became a creature of the night, its existence marked by fear and hatred. It was not bound by walls or doors, it could slip into homes through the smallest cracks, its breath chilling the air, its presence bringing dread. It could mimic voices, calling out to loved ones with a familiarity that masked its malevolence. Its power was not just in its ability to transform, but in the psychological terror it wielded, preying on fear as much as on flesh. But beneath the horror, there was a story of warning, a lesson carried through generations. The Skinwalker was not born, it was made. It was a reminder of the dangers of straying too far from the teachings that held the people together. It was a reflection of what could happen when the balance between the sacred and the profane was broken. One tale tells of a man who became consumed by jealousy. His brother was a respected leader, loved by their people, while he remained in the shadows. The bitterness grew within him until it was all he could feel, poisoning his thoughts and actions. Desperate to gain power, he sought out a forbidden ceremony, one that required him to betray the very blood he envied. When the act was done, he found himself transformed, but the power he had gained came at the cost of his humanity. His people turned against him, and he fled into the wilderness, where he became the thing they feared most. Another story speaks of a woman who was driven by grief. Her child was taken by illness, and in her sorrow, she called out to the spirits for a way to bring him back. But her cries were answered not by the spirits of light, but by those who thrived on despair. They promised her a way, but the price was steep. Blinded by her pain, she agreed, only to find herself bound to a darkness she could never escape. Her form twisted, her soul lost, she became a warning to others not to let grief consume them. The myths of skinwalkers carry a weight that is felt even in the silence of the desert. They are not just tales of horror, but reflections of the human condition, of the choices that define us, and the paths we choose to walk. The fear they inspire is not just of the creature itself, but of the darkness within, the potential for anyone to fall if they stray too far from the light. The firelight flickers, and the elder's voice grows hushed. The children huddle closer, their faces pale, their eyes wide. The adults say nothing, but their gazes dart to the shadows just beyond the circle of light. The stories are old, but the fear is fresh, a reminder that some things are more than just myth. The skinwalker is not just a being, it is a warning, a shadow that lingers at the edges of the world, a whisper of what happens when the sacred is broken and darkness takes hold. The flames in the ceremonial fire danced as if alive, casting shadows that flickered and leapt against the ancient stone walls. An elder sat cross-legged near the fire, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of countless generations. Her words seemed to pierce the silence, weaving a tale so raw and haunting that even the night seemed to hold its breath. In the heart of Navajo society, witchcraft is more than an abstract concept, it is a force that challenges the very fabric of existence. It's spoken of in hushed tones, its presence a shadow lingering on the edge of daily life. To the Navajo, witchcraft isn't just an act, it's a deliberate choice, a betrayal of community and harmony. The elder's voice trembled with intensity as she described the witches who sought to disrupt the sacred balance. In Navajo tradition, life is a delicate web, each strand woven from relationships, respect, and spiritual understanding. Witchcraft cuts through that web like a knife, an act of selfishness and cruelty. It is feared not only for what it does, but for what it represents, a rejection of everything sacred. The stories tell of witches who wear the skins of animals, who walk unseen in the night, who bring sickness and misfortune with a whispered curse. These figures are not distant or mythical, they are real, present dangers. The fear they inspire is palpable, a reminder that trust can be broken, that evil can wear familiar faces. But for the Hopi, the perception shifts. In their tightly knit villages, witchcraft takes on a different meaning. It is less about individual malice and more about communal disruption. The Hopi believe deeply in unity, in the power of the collective spirit. Witchcraft is not merely an act of harm, it is a fracture in the community's foundation, a threat to their way of life. The Hopi elders speak of witches as those who sow discord, who plant seeds of jealousy and hatred. They tell of individuals who manipulate spiritual forces for selfish gain, disregarding the well-being of their neighbors. In Hopi culture, the greatest fear is not the act of witchcraft itself, but the division it creates. Harmony is everything, and witchcraft is its antithesis. One tale recounts a time when crops failed, and famine loomed over a Hopi village. The people gathered to pray and dance, calling upon their kachinas for help. But their efforts seemed cursed, the rains would not come. Whispers began to spread, someone among them had turned to witchcraft. The tension grew unbearable, neighbors accusing neighbors, until the village was on the brink of collapse. It was only when an elder intervened, urging forgiveness and unity, that the rains finally fell. In both Navajo and Hopi societies, witchcraft is a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of humanity. Yet, the ways they confront it reveal the core of their beliefs. For the Navajo, it is about safeguarding the balance, protecting the web of life from those who would destroy it. For the Hopi, it is about preserving unity, ensuring that the community stands strong against forces that would tear it apart. The elder's voice softened as she finished her story, her eyes scanning the faces around the fire. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet resolve. Witchcraft, she seemed to say, was not something to be ignored or underestimated. It was a reminder of the power of choice, of the fragile line between good and evil, harmony and chaos. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and cedar through the night. The fire burned brighter, as if defying the darkness that crept ever closer. The elder's words lingered in the air, a call to vigilance, a plea for understanding. In the Navajo and Hopi ways, the battle against witchcraft is not just a fight against unseen forces, it is a fight for the soul of their people, a fight to hold onto what is sacred, no matter the cost. The night was unnervingly still, a silence that pressed against the ears and made the heart race. In the shadows of the canyon, beneath a sky heavy with stars, a figure moved alone, carrying the weight of a choice that could never be undone. There are whispers about nights like this, moments when the boundary between man and beast begins to blur, when the first steps are taken toward becoming something no longer human. Becoming a skinwalker is not an accident. It is a path chosen, an initiation that demands a price so steep it leaves an unhealable scar on the soul. It begins with a betrayal, an act so dark it severs ties to kin, to community, to any semblance of humanity. The stories speak of those who sacrifice a loved one, their hands stained with blood under the light of the moon. The act is deliberate, cold, and final. In that moment, they surrender their heart to darkness. They say the ceremony is as haunting as the act itself. Cloaked figures gather under the cover of night, their faces hidden, their chants low and guttural. The air is thick with the acrid smell of burning herbs, a smoke that clings to the skin and chokes the lungs. The initiate stands in the center, trembling, not with fear, but with anticipation. This is the moment they are remade, their old life stripped away, their new identity forged in shadow. The transformation begins with the donning of a skin, wolf, coyote, or even raven. The animal becomes a second skin, a part of their being. It is not merely worn, but fused to the soul, a binding of man and beast. As the skin settles, the initiate feels a shift, a crawling sensation beneath the flesh. Their senses sharpen, the world becomes brighter, louder, more vivid. But with this newfound power comes an insatiable hunger, a yearning that can never be satisfied. The elders warn that once this path is taken, there is no going back. The skinwalker is bound to the darkness, their humanity buried so deeply it can never resurface. They are cursed to walk between worlds, neither fully man nor beast, neither alive nor truly dead. Their eyes burn with a feral light, their movements swift and unnervingly fluid. They become creatures of the night, feared and reviled by those they once called family. The power of the skinwalker is undeniable. They can shift forms at will, moving silently through the wilderness, their presence marked only by the sudden chill in the air. They can mimic voices, deceive the unwary, and inflict pain with a mere glance. But this power comes at a cost, an unending torment, a void where the soul once resided. The initiation is not just a physical transformation but a spiritual rupture. The skinwalker severs their connection to the sacred, to the harmony that binds all living things. They become outcasts, hunted by the community, their name spoken only in fear and hatred. And yet, some are drawn to this path, lured by the promise of power, of freedom from the constraints of ordinary life. In the stillness of the canyon, the figure kneels, the skin of a coyote draped over their shoulders. The chants grow louder, a cacophony of voices that seems to rise from the earth itself. The initiate closes their eyes, their breath shallow, their heart pounding like a drum. This is the moment of surrender, the point of no return. The air crackles with an unnatural energy, the ground trembling as if recoiling from the act taking place. And then it is done. The figure rises, their movements no longer entirely human. Their eyes glow in the darkness, their breath visible in the cold night air. The chants fade, replaced by an eerie silence, a silence that seems to echo with the weight of what has just occurred. The new skinwalker steps into the shadows, disappearing from sight, their presence marked only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a coyote. The stories warn that this path is a curse, not a gift. But for those who choose it, the allure of power is worth any price. The skinwalker is both hunter and hunted, a creature of legend and fear, their existence a testament to the darkness that lies within us all. The night was suffocating, the air heavy and unmoving, as if nature itself held its breath. In the heart of the wilderness, where no light dared intrude, figures gathered around a fire that burned with an unsettling green hue. The flames twisted unnaturally, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, stretching long fingers across the earth. This was not an ordinary gathering. It was a place where humanity met its darkest desires, where the forbidden was no longer whispered about, but enacted in terrible silence. There is a kind of dread that seeps into the bones when rituals of this kind take place. These ceremonies are not meant for curious eyes or trembling hands. They belong to those who have abandoned the light entirely, their hearts consumed by a hunger that cannot be named. The chants begin low, almost a hum, vibrating in the chest like the growl of an unseen predator. It is a sound that unravels the edges of sanity, pulling the participants deeper into its grip. The ritual requires more than courage. It demands sacrifice, not just of blood but of the soul itself. The altar is prepared with meticulous precision, stones arranged in patterns too intricate for chance, symbols etched into the ground that seem to writhe when looked at directly. At the center lies an object of grim significance, a bone dagger, its edge darkened with use, its surface marked with ancient runes. It is both tool and curse, a bridge to a power no mortal was ever meant to wield. To begin, the initiate steps forward, their face concealed beneath a mask of animal hide. Their hands tremble slightly, a betrayal of the storm raging within. The elder, a figure cloaked in black and impossible to see clearly, speaks in a voice like gravel grinding beneath heavy boots. The language is ancient, each word falling like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the air. The initiate responds in kind, their voice cracking under the weight of what they are about to do. Then comes the offering. The dagger is raised high, catching the eerie light of the fire, and brought down with a force that makes the earth seem to shudder. Blood spills onto the ground, dark and steaming, soaking into the symbols carved into the soil. The air grows thick, almost unbreathable, as if the atmosphere itself recoils from the act. The fire surges, roaring like a beast, its flames licking the sky in defiance of natural law. The transformation is not instant. It begins as a feeling, a crawling under the skin, a sensation that something alien now resides within. The initiate doubles over, clutching their stomach, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The chants grow louder, rising to a fever pitch, a symphony of voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadows around the fire move faster now, swirling like a vortex, closing in on the initiate as if drawn to their pain. And then it happens. The first scream tears through the night, raw and guttural, a sound that no human throat should be able to produce. The initiate's body convulses, their limbs contorting into shapes that defy anatomy. Their eyes glow faintly, an otherworldly light that pierces the darkness. When the screaming stops, the figure that rises from the ground is no longer entirely human. Their features are sharper, their movements unnaturally fluid, their presence radiating an aura of something deeply wrong. The elder steps forward, inspecting the new creation with an air of satisfaction. The ritual has worked. The initiate has been remade, their humanity stripped away, replaced by something far more primal, more dangerous. The elder speaks again, a single command that sends the transformed figure into the shadows, their task unknown but undoubtedly sinister. But the ritual does not end there. The gathered participants must seal the act with their own offerings, smaller but no less significant. They prick their fingers with the bone dagger, letting drops of their blood fall into the flames. The fire hisses and sputters with each offering, as if drinking in the essence of those who dare to witness the ritual. When the last drop falls, the fire dies abruptly, plunging the clearing into total darkness. The silence is deafening, broken only by the sound of retreating footsteps as the participants fade into the night, their faces hidden, their hearts heavier than before. For those who take part in these rituals, there is no return to normalcy. They carry the weight of what they have seen, what they have done, like an invisible brand burned into their very being. They are marked, forever tethered to the power they have summoned, their lives irrevocably changed. The forbidden has a way of clinging, its shadow stretching far beyond the confines of the ceremony itself. And yet, the allure remains. For every whispered warning, there are those who cannot resist the pull of the unknown, the promise of power beyond comprehension. They seek out the elders, offer their sacrifices, and step willingly into the circle of fire. They believe they can control the darkness, bend it to their will. But the truth is far more sinister. The darkness is never truly tamed, it only waits, biding its time, growing stronger with every act of devotion. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it an unnatural chill. The night was darker than usual, the moon veiled behind thick, restless clouds. In the distance, a figure stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, clutching a bundle of twisted herbs and a single black feather. Their face was hidden by a hood, but the tremor in their hands betrayed the weight of what was about to happen. They were not alone. Something unseen watched from the shadows, waiting, its presence as palpable as the cold air pressing against the skin. The pact begins not with words, but with silence, an oppressive, deafening void that fills the air and sinks into the bones. The figure kneels, spreading the herbs and feather on the ground before lighting them aflame. The smoke rises in a serpentine curl, carrying with it a pungent, acrid scent. As it drifts into the night, the atmosphere changes. The air grows heavier, the temperature plummets, and the shadows deepen, moving as if alive. Then comes the voice, not spoken, but heard inside the mind. It is low, guttural, and dripping with malice. "Why have you called me?" it demands, each word slithering like a serpent through the thoughts of the one who summoned it. The figure hesitates, their breath hitching. Fear thickens the air, but desperation steels their resolve. They speak, their voice trembling yet firm. "I seek power. I seek vengeance. I seek what this world has denied me." A cruel chuckle echoes in the mind, cold and sharp. "You wish to bargain with me? Do you know the cost?" The voice lingers on the last word, drawing it out like a predator savoring its prey. The figure nods, unable to speak. They have been warned of the risks, told of the horrors that accompany such deals, but desperation has blinded them to reason. They would rather face damnation than remain powerless. From the smoke emerges a form, not fully visible, but enough to make the heart race and the stomach churn. Its eyes gleam with a sickly yellow light, and its limbs twist unnaturally as it moves closer. It is not bound by the rules of flesh or bone, it is something older, something wrong. The entity circles the figure, examining them with a mixture of amusement and hunger. "Your request is simple," it says. "But my price is not." Its voice changes now, growing softer, more enticing. "You will give me a part of yourself, your essence, your soul. In return, I will grant you what you seek. Do you accept?" The figure hesitates, their mind racing. This is the moment where many falter, where the enormity of the decision crushes them. But for those who go through with it, there is no turning back. With trembling hands, the figure raises a blade and makes a shallow cut on their palm. Blood drips onto the ground, mingling with the remnants of the burned herbs. The entity lets out a satisfied growl. "It is done," it says, its voice now reverberating with power. The wind picks up, swirling violently around the cliff as the pact is sealed. The figure feels a surge of energy course through their veins, a fire igniting within them that they have never known. But it is not a clean power, it is wild, chaotic, and tainted by the darkness from which it came. The entity fades back into the shadows, leaving behind a final warning. "Remember this, mortal, what I give, I can also take. Use your gift wisely, for it is not without consequence." The figure is left alone on the cliff, the smoke dissipating into the night. They have what they wanted, but at what cost? From that moment, they are changed. The pact with the spirit grants them abilities beyond human comprehension, but it also comes with a shadow that follows them everywhere. Their dreams are no longer their own, filled with whispers and glimpses of the entity's twisted form. Their body bears the mark of the pact, a subtle yet undeniable reminder of what they have done. And their soul, whether they acknowledge it or not, has been forever altered. The aftermath of such alliances is never simple. The power granted is intoxicating, often leading to acts of unimaginable destruction. Some find themselves consumed by the very darkness they sought to control, their humanity slipping away with each passing day. Others attempt to resist, to use the power for good, but the spirits do not forget. They wait, biding their time, ensuring that their end of the bargain is fulfilled in ways the mortal could never predict. And so the cycle continues. Desperation drives mortals to the edge of reason, leading them to summon forces they cannot truly understand. The spirits answer, their motives shrouded in mystery, their power both a gift and a curse. The pacts they forge leave scars, not just on the individuals who make them, but on the world itself, ripples of darkness spreading outwards, touching everything in their path. The fire crackled softly in the stillness of the night, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls of the small, dimly lit room. A man sat alone, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. His name was Tan, once known as a healer in his village, a man of compassion and wisdom. Now, he was something else entirely. His eyes, once warm and full of life, glinted with a strange, hollow light, and a faint, unnatural smile curled his lips as he stared into the flames. Tan's descent began with a single choice. A drought had swept through the region, leaving fields barren and bellies empty. His people begged for relief, their faith in his knowledge unshakable. But Tan was no god. He was just a man, and the burden of their suffering weighed on him like chains. So, when the whispers came, soft, sweet promises of rain in exchange for something precious, he listened. At first, the offer seemed impossible, ridiculous even. A voice from the shadows? A deal with something unseen? Yet as the days passed, and the cries of starving children pierced his soul, the voice grew louder, more persuasive. You can save them, it said, laced with an almost mocking pity. All it takes is one small act. One moment of courage. Desperation drowned reason. On a moonless night, Tan ventured to the forbidden place on the outskirts of the village. It was a hollow tree, ancient and twisted, where no bird dared to perch. There, he found an object buried beneath its roots, a small, black stone that pulsed faintly in his hand. As he held it, the whispers became deafening, filling his mind with promises of power, of control, of salvation. All he had to do was hold it close and speak the words. Rain came the very next morning, pouring down in torrents that filled the cracked earth and swelled the rivers. The people celebrated, lifting Tan on their shoulders, praising him as a savior. But that night, as the village slept, Tan sat alone with the stone. Its warmth now felt alive, pulsating in time with his heartbeat. You've tasted power, the voice murmured. But there is so much more to take. To hold. To be. What began as a sacrifice for his people soon turned into a hunger of his own. The stone, always with him, began to feel like an extension of his body. It whispered in the quiet moments, guiding him, coaxing him to push further. Crops flourished under his hands, livestock grew stronger, and his village prospered like never before. But the price was steep, though he refused to acknowledge it. The first sign came in the form of his reflection. Standing by a still pond, Tan saw not his own face, but something twisted, a shadow of himself, smiling back with cold, dark eyes. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers returned, soothing and insistent. It's only the beginning. You're becoming something greater. The villagers, blind to his internal struggle, grew more dependent on him. Their praise fed his pride, and their endless gratitude made him feel invincible. But as the seasons passed, their joy turned to unease. Crops grew too large, unnaturally so, their taste bitter and metallic. Animals birthed deformed offspring, their cries echoing eerily in the night. When a young boy fell ill, his skin mottled with strange, blackened veins, they came to Tan for answers. He assured them it was nothing, though he knew better. The whispers had grown darker, their promises laced with venom. They're ungrateful, they hissed. They take what you give and dare to doubt you. Show them your strength. Show them who you've become. Tan's temper, once gentle, turned sharp and cruel. He lashed out at those who questioned him, his voice booming with a power that made the earth tremble. The villagers, once filled with awe, began to fear him. Mothers pulled their children close as he passed, and men whispered of leaving the village for good. The turning point came when a young woman named Lena, brave and kind, confronted him. "What have you done, Tan?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This isn't you. Whatever you've taken, it's poisoning all of us." The word struck something deep within him, a faint echo of the man he once was. But the stone burned hot in his pocket, and the whispers screamed. "She threatens you. Destroy her." In a fit of rage, Tan raised his hand, and a bolt of searing light shot from his palm, striking Lena down. The village watched in horror as her lifeless body crumpled to the ground. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft, cruel laughter of the voice in his mind. Tan stood frozen, staring at what he'd done. The whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, twisting his grief into something unrecognizable. "They'll never forgive you now. But does it matter? You have the power. You have me." One by one, the villagers fled, leaving behind their homes, their fields, their memories. Tan remained, alone with his power and his torment. The land around him withered, consumed by the darkness that had taken root in his soul. The stone, once warm and vibrant, turned cold and lifeless in his hand, though the whispers never ceased. Tan's story is not unique. Tales of corruption echo through time, each one a cautionary tale of those who reached for power without understanding its cost. Some began with noble intentions, like Tan, only to lose themselves along the way. Others sought power for its own sake, their greed driving them to unimaginable acts. The common thread in all these stories is the price, a price that is always higher than it seems, paid not just in flesh or blood but in the erosion of humanity itself. Those who succumb to the lure of power become shadows of their former selves, their lives consumed by the very thing they sought to control. The moon hung low, its silver light spilling over the rugged desert, painting the sand and rocks in a haunting glow. Somewhere in the stillness, a coyote howled, its mournful cry echoing through the empty night. Beneath the shadow of a jagged cliff, a figure crouched, their breath shallow and their hands trembling. The transformation was about to begin. It started with a shudder that ran through their entire body, like icy water seeping into their bones. Their skin prickled and stretched, pulling tight in some places and melting away in others. The sound of cracking echoed faintly as their limbs bent at unnatural angles. Pain ripped through them, sharp and searing, but they bit their lip to keep from crying out. They couldn't risk being heard, not yet. The first shift was always the hardest. It required focus, a razor-sharp determination to suppress the fear and embrace the chaos tearing through their body. Slowly, their hands elongated, the fingers narrowing and fusing, claws sprouting where nails once were. Fur began to sprout along their arms, coarse and dark, spreading like wildfire. Their face twisted and contorted, the bones reshaping themselves as their jaw extended. Teeth sharpened, their edges gleaming in the moonlight, and their nose darkened, flattening as their human features dissolved. When the transformation was complete, what remained was no longer a person. A wolf emerged from the shadows, its amber eyes glinting with an intelligence far beyond that of a mere animal. It sniffed the air, every scent sharper and more vivid than ever before. The world was alive in a way it never was as a human, the rustle of leaves, the scuttle of tiny paws against the ground, even the faint vibrations of the earth beneath its feet. Every sound, every movement was a thread in the intricate web of existence, and the wolf could feel them all. But this wasn't a wolf in the ordinary sense. The creature carried purpose, a dark and twisted intent that burned hotter than the primal instincts surging through its veins. It wasn't there to hunt for food or protect a pack. It had a mission, a silent, deadly one. Shapeshifting was never random. Every form taken had a purpose, every transformation tied to a need or a desire. The wolf was a predator, its sleek body built for speed and stealth, perfect for stalking an enemy under the cover of night. Its senses were heightened to catch even the faintest traces of fear, and its strength was enough to tear through flesh with ease. On another night, the figure might have chosen a bird instead. A raven, black as the void, with feathers that gleamed like oil in the sunlight. As a bird, they could soar high above the earth, spying on the unsuspecting from a vantage point no human could reach. The wind would carry them effortlessly, silent and watchful, their keen eyes capturing every detail below. For more intimate work, a snake was often preferred. Smooth and silent, a snake could slip through cracks and crevices, unseen and unnoticed. Its venom, though potent, was rarely used. Its mere presence was enough to instill terror. Few things unnerved humans more than the slither of scales against the floorboards or the glint of fangs in the dark. The transformation was not without cost. Each time the figure shifted, they left a part of themselves behind. Their humanity eroded with every change, their connection to the world of men growing thinner and more fragile. The line between who they were and what they became blurred, until it was almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. But it was addictive. The power, the freedom, the thrill of shedding one's skin and becoming something else entirely, it was a temptation that could not be ignored. They no longer feared the creatures of the night, they were the creatures of the night, and the world was theirs to command. There was a strange, bitter beauty in the act of shapeshifting. The agony of transformation was a reminder of the price they paid, but the moment it was complete, the pain vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of possibility. As a wolf, they could run for miles without tiring, their muscles rippling with strength. As a bird, they could touch the sky, their wings slicing through the air with effortless grace. As a snake, they could feel the pulse of the earth beneath them, every vibration a whisper of life. But there were rules, unspoken and unyielding. Shapeshifting was not a gift freely given, it was a pact, a binding agreement with forces older and darker than memory. Breaking those rules meant certain doom, a descent into madness and oblivion that no one could escape. And then, there was the fear. The constant, gnawing fear of losing control. Of becoming so consumed by the animal within that they could no longer find their way back. It was a fear that kept them awake at night, their human mind grappling with the growing darkness in their soul. But for now, there was no time for fear. The wolf stood tall, its ears pricked and its nose twitching. A scent lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. Its prey was near. With a low growl, it leapt forward, its paws silent against the ground as it raced through the desert. The thrill of the hunt coursed through its veins, its heart pounding in rhythm with the earth itself. Every movement was calculated, every step bringing it closer to its target. And as the shadows swallowed it whole, the wolf disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of its growl behind. The fire flickered low, its light dancing against the cave walls, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. A chill clung to the air, sharp and biting, as though the stone itself held memories of countless winters. Across the room, a figure stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the wavering flame. But it wasn't the fire they saw, it was something far more sinister. A whisper rose, faint and fleeting, carried on a breath of wind that shouldn't exist in the stillness. It seemed to curl around them, brushing against their ear, a voice neither near nor far. They blinked, and the cave was gone. Instead, they stood in an open field, the grass swaying under a pale moonlight that seemed too bright, too sharp. A figure approached from the distance, cloaked in shadow. It was familiar, so painfully familiar that their heart ached at the sight. Yet, something was wrong. The figure's movements were off, unnatural, like a puppet pulled by strings. "Do you know me?" the figure asked, its voice soft yet echoing as though it came from every direction. The answer was on the tip of their tongue, but they couldn't speak. Fear clawed at their throat, freezing the words before they could form. Illusions were not mere tricks of light or fleeting deceptions. They were crafted from the threads of reality, woven into something that felt so real it could tear the soul apart. Those who wielded this power understood that fear wasn't born from what the eye could see, it thrived in the mind, in the cracks where doubt and terror took root. A master illusionist knew how to find those cracks, how to widen them until their victim was drowning in a sea of their own nightmares. They could take the simplest memory, a childhood home, a lost loved one, and twist it into something monstrous. What should bring comfort instead became a weapon, each detail sharpened to cut deeper into the heart. In the wrong hands, illusions weren't simply tools, they were arsenals. A barren desert could become a sprawling forest, its trees shifting and reshaping to trap those who wandered too far. A calm village could erupt into chaos, every face twisted into something grotesque, every familiar voice turning to screams. But the power wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a faint sound that shouldn't be there. A door that opened on its own, leading to a place that couldn't possibly exist. The soft laughter of a child when no one was around. The most effective illusions were the ones that made people doubt themselves. They didn't overwhelm, they whispered, coaxing their victims to question their own reality. Was that shadow always there? Did the ground just move? Why did the mirror show something that wasn't in the room? There was a cruel brilliance in the way these illusions played on the human mind. People clung to what they believed was real, even when the world around them crumbled. They tried to rationalize the impossible, to find logic in chaos. And that struggle, that desperate need for control, was where the illusionists found their strength. For some, the manipulation was an art. They could create beauty as easily as horror, a sunrise that never ended, a melody so sweet it brought tears to the eyes. But beauty was fleeting, and its power paled in comparison to fear. Fear lingered. It clung to the soul, whispering long after the illusion had faded. The figure in the field began to change, its form melting and shifting like wax under a flame. What had once been familiar became unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of what it once was. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, its mouth stretching wide in a grin that split its face. "Do you know me now?" it asked, its voice warped and hollow. They tried to run, but the ground beneath them gave way, crumbling into darkness. They fell, the wind roaring past them, their screams swallowed by the void. And then, silence. They opened their eyes and found themselves back in the cave, the fire still flickering low. Their heart raced, their body trembling, but the room was unchanged. A laugh echoed behind them, soft and taunting. They turned, but there was no one there. This was the power of illusion, not just to deceive the senses, but to leave a mark, a scar that couldn't be erased. It wasn't the illusion itself that haunted its victims, it was the memory of it, the doubt it planted, the way it made them question everything they thought they knew. Even now, as they sat by the fire, they couldn't shake the feeling that the room wasn't as empty as it seemed. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the forest, sharp and brutal. The figure stood motionless, their breath visible in the icy air, yet their face betrayed no pain. A moment ago, their arm had been bent at an impossible angle, crushed under the weight of a fallen tree. Now, as the last of the signaling cracks rang out, the arm was whole again, the skin smooth and unmarked, as though the injury had never been. This was no ordinary body. Strength like this wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with roars or grand gestures. It lingered quietly, waiting to reveal itself when it was least expected. The strength was primal, untamed, and terrifying in its silence. It wasn't about how much weight could be lifted or how far someone could run. It was about defying what the human body was meant to endure, about crossing the line between mortal and something far beyond. A hunter's scream shattered the quiet night. The sound carried desperation, sharp as a blade, cutting through the silence of the wilderness. He had been running, his feet pounding against the ground, leaving a trail of broken branches and churned soil. But the faster he moved, the closer the footsteps behind him became. He stumbled, his chest heaving, lungs burning with every breath. When he looked back, he saw it, eyes glowing like embers in the dark, a silhouette larger than life moving effortlessly between the trees. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. No human could run like that, their strides devouring the ground, their movements unerring, as if the night itself bent to their will. There were stories of strength that didn't come from muscle alone. Strength that defied reason, that wasn't bound by the rules of flesh and bone. The kind of power that lifted boulders without effort, snapped iron chains like threads, and tore through obstacles as though they were nothing. But it was the endurance that truly unnerved, the unrelenting stamina, the ability to push through pain and exhaustion without pause. In one tale, a woman carried a wounded man for miles, her feet sinking into snow as the wind howled around her. The weight of his body should have crushed her, her bones should have buckled under the strain. But she didn't stop, even when her shoulders bled, even when her legs gave out and she had to crawl. By the time she reached the village, the man was alive, but her hands were raw, her nails torn away. Yet, she simply stood, her breath calm, her face expressionless. Another time, a boy was caught in a rockslide. The boulders buried him, their crushing weight leaving only his head above the rubble. No one thought he would survive, but when they began to dig, they found him holding one of the rocks, massive and jagged, above his chest. His arms trembled, his face pale, but he didn't let go. By the time they freed him, his body was covered in bruises, his skin torn in places, yet he stood, unbroken, his grip still firm on the rock. Such strength came at a cost. It wasn't free, nor was it natural. The power wasn't theirs alone, it came from something else, something that demanded more than muscle and will. Some whispered that it came from pacts, from rituals too terrible to speak aloud. Others believed the strength wasn't given at all, but stolen, taken from the lives of others, their essence drained to fuel an unholy endurance. Whatever the source, the result was undeniable. They could leap higher than any predator, their feet leaving the earth only to land with precision and silence. They could crush bones with a grip, their fingers tightening like iron clamps. Their voices, when they chose to use them, could roar louder than storms, their echoes reverberating through mountains and valleys. But strength wasn't always about destruction. Sometimes, it was about control. It was the ability to hold back when every instinct screamed to lash out. To carry the weight of impossible choices, to endure suffering that would break anyone else. It was in the way they moved through the world, their footsteps light yet unyielding, each step a quiet assertion of dominance. The hunter's scream faded into the forest, swallowed by the night. The figure stopped, their head tilting slightly as they listened. They didn't need to chase anymore. They knew the hunter wouldn't escape. He could run for hours, days even, but it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't tire. They never did. Power like this didn't belong in the hands of the compassionate. It wasn't meant to protect or save, it was meant to dominate, to terrify, to remind the world of its fragility. Those who wielded it became something more than human, but also less. They lost the softness of humanity, the vulnerability that connected them to others. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, fragile, where the strength seemed almost tender. Like when the woman carried the man through the snow, her arms trembling not from weakness, but from determination. Or when the boy held the boulder, his face set not in anger, but in resolve. Even in their power, there was a trace of something human, something that whispered of sacrifice and pain. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was something harder, sharper. A reminder that strength wasn't just about what the body could do, it was about what the soul could endure. The scream was faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of the trees. But then it grew louder, raw and guttural, filled with pain so deep it seemed to shake the earth. The old woman sat in the corner of her dimly lit hut, her hands moving methodically over the crude doll in her lap. Each stitch she made was precise, deliberate, her lips murmuring words older than memory. On the ground before her lay a man writhing in agony, clutching at his chest, his breath ragged and uneven. She didn't look at him. Her focus was on the doll. With every prick of her needle, his cries grew louder, his body arching as though invisible hands were tearing him apart. When she finally tied the last knot, his body went still. Silence hung heavy in the air. Outside, under the pale light of the moon, a figure limped through the forest. Blood stained their hands and clothes, their breath shallow and uneven. They should have collapsed hours ago. Their wounds were too deep, their body too broken. But they kept moving, their steps fueled by something far beyond mortal endurance. The magic coursing through them wasn't kind. It wasn't healing in the way people imagined, a gentle touch, a soothing warmth. It was sharp, brutal, and consuming. The pain wasn't erased, it was transferred. Each step they took pulled life from the world around them. Grass withered beneath their feet, leaves curled and blackened, the air itself seemed to grow colder. Dark healing wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. For every cut that closed, something else had to break. For every bone that mended, a life was drained. And for those who wielded it, there was no hesitation, no remorse. The cost didn't matter as long as they survived. But survival came at a price. There were whispers of curses that clung to them like shadows, curses that seeped into the lives of those they touched. A child once approached an old healer, begging for help for her sick mother. The healer smiled, her eyes cold and glittering, and placed her hand on the child's head. The mother recovered within days, her strength returning as if by miracle. But the child fell silent. Her laughter, her voice, her very essence seemed to vanish. Within weeks, she was gone, her body frail and lifeless. Curses weren't always loud or dramatic. They didn't always announce themselves with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they were quiet, subtle, insidious. A man who had wronged a healer woke one morning to find his reflection missing from the mirror. At first, he thought it was a trick, a figment of his imagination. But as days turned into weeks, he began to notice other things. Shadows that didn't quite match his movements. Objects disappearing from his grasp without explanation. The curse didn't kill him, it unmade him, piece by piece, until he was little more than a hollow shell of who he had been. The power to heal and the power to curse were two sides of the same coin. To mend one thing often meant breaking another. It wasn't about good or evil, right or wrong. It was about balance. The scales were always tipping, and those who wielded such power knew how to use it to their advantage. There was a story of a warrior who had been fatally wounded in battle. His comrades carried him to a secluded hut deep in the mountains, where a reclusive healer was said to live. The healer agreed to save him, but warned that his life would come with a curse. Desperate, the warrior agreed. As the healer worked, the warrior's wounds began to close, his strength returning as if by magic. But when he stood to thank the healer, his reflection in the nearby stream showed not a man, but a beast with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. It wasn't always the cursed who suffered. Sometimes, the healers themselves bore the weight of their magic. Their bodies became marked by the lives they had taken, their eyes clouded with shadows, their hands trembling from the burden of what they had done. They were feared and hated, not just for their power, but for what it cost them. And yet, they continued. They stitched wounds, mended bones, and saved lives, knowing that every act of healing left a scar on their soul. Their curses were tools, weapons wielded not out of malice, but necessity. They understood better than anyone that power wasn't kind, and survival wasn't free. The old woman in the hut looked down at the doll in her hands. The man on the floor was still, his chest no longer rising and falling. She sighed, her fingers brushing over the stitches one last time before setting the doll aside. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if mourning what had just happened. The man who had been limping through the woods stopped at the edge of a clearing, his wounds now little more than faint scars. His eyes glinted in the moonlight, sharp and unyielding. He took a deep breath, the air cold against his skin, and smiled. The magic had worked. For now. But somewhere, someone else was suffering, their body broken, their life unraveling. The cost had been paid, and the balance restored. The fire crackled softly, its light casting long, flickering shadows on the faces of those gathered around. The old man, his voice low and heavy, began to speak. His words carried the weight of something ancient, something no one dared interrupt. "It was a night like this," he said, his eyes distant, "when I first saw it." The others leaned in closer, their breaths visible in the chill air. The wind whispered through the trees, almost as if it, too, wanted to listen. He described a quiet evening on the outskirts of his village. He had been walking home, his path lit only by the pale glow of the moon. The air had been unnervingly still, not even the usual chirping of crickets to break the silence. That's when he heard it, a faint shuffle in the bushes. He stopped, his heart quickening. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or a wandering coyote. But then he saw the eyes, glowing yellow, piercing through the darkness like embers. They were too large, too intelligent, to belong to any ordinary creature. "It stood up," the old man said, his voice trembling. "Not on 4 legs, but 2. Its shape shifted, twisting like smoke. One moment, it was a man. The next, a wolf. And then, something I cannot describe. The crowd around the fire shuddered. The old man's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. I ran, he admitted, his voice hoarse. I didn't look back. But I could feel it watching me, chasing me, not with its feet, but with its eyes, its presence. It wanted me to know it could catch me if it chose. The fire popped loudly, startling a few of the listeners. Another voice broke the silence. A younger woman, her face pale and her hands trembling, spoke up. I've seen it too, she said. All eyes turned to her. She hesitated, swallowing hard, before continuing. I was with my brother, she began. We were camping near the canyon. It was supposed to be a fun trip, just the two of us. We didn't think anything of the strange noises we heard that first night. We thought it was the wind, or maybe animals. Her voice faltered, and tears welled up in her eyes. But on the second night, she said, we saw footprints around our tent. They were huge, like a bear's, but they weren't right. The toes were long and thin, almost like fingers. Her breath hitched, and she pressed her hands together as though trying to steady herself. My brother wanted to investigate, she whispered. I begged him not to, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was probably nothing, just a prank or some animal. He went into the woods with a flashlight. The firelight reflected in her wide, tear-filled eyes as she spoke the next words. I waited for him. Minutes turned into hours, and he didn't come back. I called his name, but the forest felt wrong. Like it was swallowing my voice. And then I heard it, a laugh. Not his. It was low and guttural, like it was mocking me. She took a shaky breath. When he finally came back, she continued, he wasn't the same. He looked like my brother, but his eyes, they were empty, like something else was wearing his skin. He didn't talk. He just sat by the fire, staring at me, smiling that awful smile. The silence that followed her words was heavy, almost suffocating. A third person, a middle-aged man with scars lining his hands, spoke next. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a lingering fear. I don't have a story about seeing one, he said. But I felt it. He paused, as though searching for the right words. I was a hunter, he explained. I've spent more nights in the wilderness than I can count. I've seen all kinds of animals, faced down predators, and survived storms. But nothing prepared me for that night. He described setting up camp deep in the woods, miles away from any other human. The fire had been warm, the stars bright. Everything had seemed normal, until it wasn't. The air changed, he said, his voice tight. It got heavy, thick, like I was breathing water. The forest went silent. No rustling leaves, no animal calls, nothing. And then I felt it, eyes on me. Not one pair, but many. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening as he continued. It wasn't like being watched by an animal, he said. Animals look at you out of curiosity or fear. This was different. This was hatred. Malice. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was there, circling me, toying with me. He paused, his hands gripping his knees. I didn't sleep that night, he admitted. I kept the fire going and sat with my back against a tree, my rifle in my lap. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and left. But even now, years later, I can still feel it. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that same presence, like it never really left. The fire crackled again, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The group sat in silence, their faces pale, their bodies tense. The stories hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with fear and unease. One by one, the storytellers fell silent, their voices replaced by the quiet crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. No one dared to speak, to ask questions, to break the fragile stillness that had settled over the group. They knew the stories were more than just tales. They were warnings, etched into the memories of those who had lived to tell them. The cold wind howled through the narrow canyon, carrying with it whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was the dead of night, and the village elders sat in a tight circle around the fire. Their faces, carved by years of wisdom and pain, were marked with shadows that danced and flickered. The flames offered little warmth against the chill that ran deeper than the skin. This was a cold that settled in the soul. A young man stood before them, his hands bound with rough rope. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes wide with terror. He pleaded, his voice cracking, "I swear, I have done nothing. You have to believe me." But belief was not enough. Not now. The whispers in the community had grown too loud to ignore. Livestock found dead with no sign of wounds, crops withering overnight, and children falling ill with fevers that no healer could cure. These were not accidents. Fear had taken root in their hearts, spreading like wildfire, and with fear came blame. The young man's mother stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her tears fell silently as she watched her son, knowing that no amount of begging would change what was about to happen. The elders began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. It was not a prayer, but something darker, something meant to draw out the truth, or force it to reveal itself. The fire flared suddenly, as if answering their call, and the crowd gasped. The young man's cries grew more desperate. "Please! I am not a witch," he screamed, his voice echoing through the canyon. But his words fell on ears that were deafened by fear. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, an elder shrouded in a heavy cloak. In his hand, he held a pouch filled with ash and herbs, symbols of purification and judgment. He threw the mixture into the fire, and the flames turned a sickly green. The crowd recoiled, murmuring in dread. The elder's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. "If you are innocent, the fire will spare you. But if you carry the darkness within you, it will consume you." The young man's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, sobbing. "I don't want to die," he whispered. The fire burned brighter, casting eerie shadows on the cliffs. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a mix of anticipation and horror. This was not the first time they had gathered like this. Stories of witch trials had haunted their history for generations, each tale more chilling than the last. The methods varied, some accused were tested with fire, others with water, and some simply vanished into the night, never to be seen again. The rituals were brutal, but the people believed they were necessary to protect their way of life. There was the story of a woman accused of summoning storms to destroy the village's crops. They bound her and left her in a cave, where the elders said the spirits would judge her. When they returned days later, they found the cave empty, but the villagers swore they could hear her wails in the wind every time a storm approached. Another tale spoke of a healer whose remedies began to fail, her patients dying one after another. When the elders confronted her, she admitted to using forbidden practices, claiming they were the only way to save lives. The villagers turned on her, driving her into the desert. Her screams as they left her to the elements were said to echo for miles, a reminder of what happens when one steps too far into the shadows. And now, it was the young man's turn. The elder raised his hand, signaling for silence. The chant ceased, and the only sound was the crackling of the unnatural flames. The young man was dragged to the edge of the fire, his struggles weakening as exhaustion and despair took hold. "Step forward," the elder commanded. The young man shook his head violently. "No, please, no." But the hands that gripped him were relentless, pushing him closer and closer. The crowd held their breath, their eyes locked on the scene before them. As the flames licked at his feet, something changed. The air grew heavy, charged with a tension that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. The young man stopped struggling, his body going rigid. His eyes rolled back, and a guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound no human voice should have been able to make. The crowd shrieked and stumbled backward, their fear exploding into panic. The elder dropped his pouch, his hands trembling. The young man's body convulsed, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. He collapsed to the ground, motionless. For a moment, there was silence. Then a woman screamed, pointing at the fire. The flames had returned to their natural color, but within them, shapes twisted and writhed, faces, clawed hands, and hollow eyes. The villagers fled, their terror driving them into the night. Only the elders remained, staring at the fire with grim determination. They knew this was not the end. It never was. The trials continued over the years, each one carving deeper scars into the hearts of the people. Innocence and guilt became blurred, the lines between right and wrong smudged by fear and desperation. Families were torn apart, friendships shattered, and the once close community grew distant and distrustful. Yet, even as the trials faded into history, their shadows lingered. The stories were passed down, whispered around fires on cold nights, each retelling a reminder of the price they paid to feel safe. The fire crackled in the heart of the night, its light casting long shadows that danced across the faces of the gathered children. Their eyes, wide with wonder and just a hint of fear, were fixed on the elder seated on a worn blanket by the flames. His voice was raspy, seasoned by years and countless stories, yet it carried a weight that demanded silence. He paused, letting the tension grow thick in the air, his gaze sweeping over the young faces. Finally, he spoke. "It was a night much like this one," he began, his voice low and measured. The moon was high, and the wind carried a strange stillness. A hunter, brave and strong, ventured into the canyon searching for game. But instead of deer tracks, he found something else, something wrong. The children leaned closer, their breaths shallow. He followed the tracks, the elder continued, but they weren't like anything he'd seen before. At first, they looked like those of a man, but as he went deeper into the canyon, they began to change. The footprints stretched, the toes sharpened, and soon, they were the tracks of a beast. One of the children gasped, earning a sharp glance from their older sibling. The elder smiled faintly but didn't stop. "He should have turned back," he said, his tone dropping into a whisper. But the hunter was curious, too curious. He pressed on until he reached a clearing. And there, in the pale moonlight, he saw it. The fire seemed to dim as he spoke, and the children huddled closer together. It stood tall, with eyes that glowed like embers and a body that shifted with each breath, part man, part animal, and something else entirely. The hunter froze, his bravery gone. The creature turned to him, its gaze piercing. Then, without a sound, it vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the smell of decay. The elder leaned back, his story hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence filled only by the crackling fire and the distant cry of a coyote. One of the braver children finally whispered, "What happened to the hunter?" The elder's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "He returned to the village," he said, "but he was never the same. His hair turned white overnight, and he spoke in riddles until his last breath. He said the creature had whispered to him, a voice that promised power and doom." The children shivered, their imaginations painting vivid pictures of the hunter's fate. These stories, passed from elder to child, were more than mere tales. They were warnings, woven into the fabric of the people's lives. Each word carried echoes of ancestors who had lived through the strange and unexplainable, their experiences transformed into lessons to protect the generations that followed. One tale spoke of a woman who ventured into the woods at dusk despite the warnings. She returned days later, her face pale and her voice gone. The villagers said she had encountered a shadow that moved without a body, a presence that followed her home. Though she lived, she was never truly free, her silence a haunting reminder of what she had seen. Another story told of a shepherd who lost his flock to the hills. When he went searching, he found the sheep, but they were changed, their eyes glowed red, and they moved as if controlled by something unseen. The shepherd fled, but he was marked, his nights forever plagued by nightmares of watching eyes and whispered threats. These stories were not written in books or etched in stone. They were carried in voices, shaped by the lips of those who spoke them and the ears of those who listened. They lived in the pauses between words, the looks exchanged across the fire, and the shivers that ran down spines. The elders knew when to embellish and when to hold back, their storytelling an art as old as the earth itself. A raised eyebrow, a lingering silence, or a sudden shout, they wielded these tools as skillfully as a painter wields a brush. But the stories were more than entertainment. They were a lifeline, a way of connecting to the past and ensuring its lessons were never forgotten. They spoke of respect for the unknown, of boundaries that must not be crossed, and of the cost of hubris. Even the most skeptical among them could not ignore the power of these tales. They might laugh at the idea of glowing eyes or cursed footprints, but they still avoided the canyons at night and hurried home when the sun dipped below the horizon. One of the most chilling stories told of a boy who dared to mock the traditions. He sneered at the warnings and claimed the stories were for fools. One night, he ventured alone into the desert, determined to prove his bravery. He returned the next morning, his face ashen and his body trembling. When asked what he had seen, he could only say, "I was wrong." He never spoke of it again, but his silence spoke louder than any words. The children who heard these stories carried them forward, their voices adding new details, their imaginations breathing fresh life into old legends. And so the cycle continued, each generation adding its thread to the tapestry. Even as the world changed, as villages grew into towns and ancient ways gave way to modern life, the stories endured. They found new homes in whispered conversations, late-night campfires, and the quiet moments before sleep. Because some things never change. The wind still howls through the canyons, the shadows still dance in the firelight, and the unknown still waits, just beyond the edge of understanding. And the stories, carried on the voices of the living, ensure that it is never forgotten. It was late, far past midnight, and the desert was as silent as a graveyard. The only sound that dared to break the stillness was the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the faintest hint of something unnameable. A man from the east, a stranger to these lands, sat in his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His eyes darted nervously, scanning the endless stretch of sand that seemed to close in around him. He had heard the stories, of course, everyone had. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of being out here, in the heart of Navajo land. He had been driving through, looking for a shortcut to save time on his way to an important meeting. He didn't understand the warnings of the locals, dismissing them as nothing more than superstition. "There's no such thing as skinwalkers," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease that had slowly crept up his spine. But then, just as the moon hung high above in the sky, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow dancing in the corner of his vision. He turned the truck's headlights in that direction, hoping to catch whatever it was. What he saw made his heart stop. A figure, cloaked in a tattered, unnatural robe, stood just beyond the range of his headlights. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. But there was something wrong, something off about him. His skin looked too pale, his eyes too dark. And though he was standing still, the figure seemed to shift, as though it was both part of the night and separate from it at the same time. The man in the truck froze. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. It was as if something was pulling him toward that shadow. The truck's engine sputtered, and in that moment, he realized the vehicle had stopped running. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided. The man's pulse raced as the creature drew closer. There was a subtle, unnatural ripple in the air around it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary person. This was something ancient, something tied to the earth and the stars, something that had been waiting, hidden, in the desert for centuries. And now, it was standing right in front of him. In that split second, as the figure reached out a hand toward him, the man finally understood what the stories had been about. The creature's eyes locked with his, and the world around him seemed to bend. He could feel the weight of 1,000 lives, of every warning he had ever dismissed, pressing down on him. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the figure was gone, disappearing into the night as though it had never been there at all. The man sat there for what felt like hours, his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. When the truck finally started again, he didn't waste a second. He drove away, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. That man wasn't the only outsider to have a run-in with the Skinwalkers. Over the years, travelers passing through Navajo lands have shared their eerie tales, stories of shadowy figures darting across their path, of unexplained noises echoing through the night. and of a sense of being watched by something not quite human. One woman, a backpacker from the city, had wandered too far off the main trail during a hiking trip. She was a seasoned traveler, accustomed to the wilderness, and had dismissed the warning signs from the locals as nothing more than superstition. As she trekked deeper into the canyon, however, she began to feel that unsettling presence, the weight of eyes upon her, invisible but undeniably there. Then, she heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything she had ever heard before. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, but there was nothing. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows growing deeper, more alive. The growl came again, this time closer, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her breath hitched in her throat as she realized she wasn't alone. In the distance, something moved, too fast to be a person, too slow to be an animal. The shadows seemed to swirl around it, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to cooperate. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with panic. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the night. Shaking and breathless, the woman managed to find her way back to the safety of the trail, her mind racing with the impossible vision she had just witnessed. She didn't tell anyone what happened. She couldn't. Who would believe her? Who would understand that what she had seen was not a hallucination, but something real, something ancient, and terrifying? For many outsiders, the stories are always just that, stories. They hear them from the locals, shake their heads, and dismiss them with a nervous chuckle. But when they're faced with the truth, when they find themselves caught in the grip of something they cannot explain, their disbelief crumbles. One man, a historian who had spent years studying Native American cultures, found himself in a remote village deep within Navajo territory. He was there to write about the tribe's traditions, but what he uncovered was far more than he bargained for. During his stay, he was invited to a gathering where elders shared their knowledge of the Skinwalkers. He was skeptical, of course, too skeptical to believe in such old myths. But as the evening wore on and the stories grew darker, he started to feel something shift in the air. When he left the gathering, his mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the tales he had heard. He stepped out into the crisp night air, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The night felt heavier, like it was closing in on him. He hurried back to his tent, but when he turned the corner, he froze. Standing at the edge of the camp, just out of the firelight, was a figure, tall, thin, and hunched in an unnatural way. Its face was pale, its eyes dark, and though it was standing still, it seemed to be watching him, waiting. For a long moment, the historian couldn't move. His heart thudded in his chest, and he thought he heard a voice, a low, chilling whisper carried by the wind. The figure was gone before he could react, vanishing into the night like it had never existed. The next morning, he left the village, unable to look anyone in the eye. What had happened? Was it a hallucination, or had he truly encountered the thing the stories warned about? He couldn't say. But one thing was certain, the myths weren't just stories anymore. They were real, and the Navajo people had known that all along. For every outsider who brushes off the tales as fiction, there are always those who, like the historian or the backpacker, find themselves caught in a web of fear and disbelief. The Skinwalkers are not just a part of Navajo lore, they are a part of the land itself, waiting, watching, and sometimes, when the time is right, they reach out to remind the world that not everything can be explained away. The wind howled outside, a low, mournful cry that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Inside the small, dimly lit home, an old woman sat by the fire. Her hands were steady as she worked, grinding herbs with a stone, her eyes focused on the task at hand. She was alone, but she had never felt so connected to the world around her. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside, her face pale and drawn with fear. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know where else to turn," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "They're coming. I can feel them. They're so close." The old woman didn't look up. She had heard these words before, countless times. Fear and desperation were familiar to her, But there was something in the younger woman's eyes, something that told her this was no ordinary plea. "You've come to the right place," the old woman said softly, her voice carrying a calmness that seemed to make the air around them still. "Tell me what you've seen." And so, the young woman began her tale, her words tumbling out in a rushed, panicked rhythm. She spoke of shadows lurking at the edge of her vision, of strange sounds in the night, and the growing feeling of being watched by something not quite human. She spoke of the chill that crept into her bones whenever she stepped outside, and of the dreams, vivid and unsettling, that left her waking in a cold sweat. The old woman nodded, her face grave. She had heard stories like this before, stories of skinwalkers, the dark, twisted beings who walked in human form but could shed their skin and take on the shapes of animals. The ones who brought terror and death to the unsuspecting. The ones who could only be stopped by those with the ancient knowledge, the medicine men and women. Medicine people. Protectors against the darkness. The old woman was one of them. A healer, a protector. She had been trained from a young age, learning the old ways from her grandmother, who had learned from hers. It was a lineage that stretched back generations, each passing the knowledge down to the next, preparing them to face the forces of darkness that threatened the land. Medicine people were more than healers, they were warriors, armed not with weapons of steel, but with the ancient wisdom that could break the hold of evil. "Come closer," the old woman said. "You've come to the right place, but you must listen carefully. I will help you, but you must be strong." The young woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She had no idea what to expect, but something about the calmness in the old woman's voice made her believe, just for a moment, that she might be safe. The old woman reached for a bundle of sage tied with twine and held it over the fire. The smoke curled upward, thick and fragrant, filling the air with a sense of calm. She muttered a prayer under her breath, the words ancient and unfamiliar. Then, with a steady hand, she pressed the bundle into the young woman's hands. "You must burn this," the old woman instructed. "And speak the words I have taught you. The smoke will cleanse you. It will protect you." The young woman nodded, her heart racing as she followed the instructions. The sage burned brightly, sending a plume of smoke into the air. She whispered the words the old woman had given her, her voice shaking at first but growing steadier with each passing moment. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, something happened. The wind outside shifted. The air grew heavier. The shadows that had once seemed distant and harmless now pressed in on the walls, gathering, swirling like a storm. The young woman felt a coldness creep down her spine, but the old woman's steady presence anchored her. The smoke from the sage seemed to protect her, a barrier against the dark forces that threatened to consume her. The old woman didn't flinch. Her eyes never left the fire, her hands still working, weaving the ancient prayers with each flicker of the flames. After a long silence, the storm outside faded. The shadows receded. And the air, which had been so thick with dread, lightened, as if the very earth had exhaled a sigh of relief. "That is the power of the old ways," the old woman said, her voice soft but firm. "The darkness cannot touch you when you call upon the spirits for protection. But remember, this is only part of the work. You must keep the light within you strong. You must never let fear take root. The skinwalkers feed on fear. It is their strength. And if you let it control you, they will come." The young woman nodded, tears streaming down her face, but a new strength shining in her eyes. She had been given a gift, a chance to fight back against the shadows that had haunted her. The old woman reached for a small bundle of feathers tied together with a red ribbon. She handed it to the young woman, pressing it gently into her hands. "This will help you," she said. "Keep it close. It will protect you when you need it most." The feathers were light, soft to the touch, but the young woman could feel the power in them. She didn't understand it fully, but she knew that this woman, this medicine woman, had given her something that was worth more than gold. "Now go," the old woman said. "The darkness has been kept at bay for now. But you must keep your heart strong. Never forget what you have learned. And always remember, you are never alone." As the young woman stepped out into the night, she felt the weight of the feathers against her chest. She had been marked, chosen to carry on the work of those who had come before her. She was no longer a helpless victim in the face of darkness. She had been given the tools to fight back, to protect herself and those she loved. The old woman watched her leave, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the fight was never truly over. There would always be darkness to battle, always skinwalkers lurking in the shadows. But as long as there were medicine men and women, as long as there were protectors who understood the old ways, the darkness would never win. And so, the circle continued, generation after generation, passing on the knowledge, the power, the responsibility. The fight against the darkness never ended, but neither did the hope that one day, the light would shine brighter. The air was thick with anticipation as the family gathered in the small, dimly lit room. Outside, the winds were beginning to pick up, howling through the cracks in the walls, as if the very earth itself were on edge. Inside, there was a silence that was almost deafening. A silence that clung to the room like a heavy blanket. The woman at the center of the room, older now but with eyes that had seen more than any of them could ever imagine, stood before a table adorned with sacred items, stones, herbs, and symbols that held a power older than time itself. She had spent her life learning the rituals, the prayers, the ways of keeping the darkness at bay. Now, it was time to protect her family once more. She looked over her shoulder at her son, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had seen the shadows creeping at the edge of his vision for weeks. He had heard the whispers in the night, the unsettling sounds of something that didn't belong. The fear in his eyes was all too familiar, but she had no time for fear tonight. Tonight was about action. The woman reached for the bundle of sage, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she lit the end of the stick. The smoke rose immediately, thick and fragrant, swirling in the air like a spirit trying to escape its earthly form. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, as if gathering the strength from the very earth beneath her feet. "Sit, child," she said softly, her voice calm, but with an undeniable weight. The boy, though reluctant, obeyed, taking his place at the table across from her. The woman took a handful of salt and sprinkled it around the room, the grains falling like tiny crystals of protection, creating a barrier between the living and the unseen. She spoke the words that had been passed down from her ancestors, the words that connected her to the spirits of the land. They were ancient, their meanings hidden in the folds of time, but they carried with them an undeniable power. As she spoke, the room seemed to grow heavier, the air thickening with the weight of the ritual. The wind outside grew louder, and for a moment, it felt as though the house itself were trembling in response. She didn't flinch. She had done this countless times before. But each time, it felt just as powerful, just as necessary. The boy watched as his mother moved with grace and purpose, her movements like a dance, her hands tracing symbols in the air, drawing lines of protection around him. The smoke from the sage seemed to wrap itself around them both, cocooning them in a veil of safety. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift inside him, something that told him, for a moment at least, that he was safe. "Close your eyes," she instructed, her voice low and soothing. "Breathe deep. Let the smoke cleanse you. Let the fear leave your body." He did as she said, his breath shaky at first, but with each inhalation, he felt something lift. The weight on his chest began to lighten. The shadows that had lurked at the corners of his mind seemed to recede, if only for a moment. It was as if the very air around him was being purified, as if the darkness had nowhere to hide anymore. The woman moved closer, now standing directly behind her son. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her fingers warm against his cold skin. She could feel the tension in his body, the knots of fear and anxiety that had settled in his bones. She whispered more words, words that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, from a place beyond the physical world. These words were not meant to be understood by the ears alone. They were meant to speak directly to the soul. The boy could feel it, the change in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His body tensed, then relaxed. A sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced washed over him. The heaviness, the constant unease, began to fade. The fear that had gripped him so tightly loosened, unraveling like a thread in the wind. Then, without warning, there was a knock at the door. The boy's heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, the room seemed to go still. The woman's hand tightened on his shoulder, a silent reminder that they had prepared for this moment. They had prepared for everything. With deliberate slowness, she stood and crossed the room to the door. The boy watched her, his pulse racing. Was it just the wind? Or was someone on the other side? When she opened the door, there was nothing there. The night was still. The wind had died down. Yet, in the stillness, the boy felt it, the presence that had been haunting him, that had been so close. She closed the door, returning to his side. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something in them, something that was not fear, not worry, but absolute certainty. "It's done," she said softly. "The darkness cannot touch you now." The boy didn't understand how or why, but he felt it. The fear that had been gnawing at him for so long was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. The weight in his chest had lifted. The shadows were no longer there. The darkness had no claim over him. He was protected. As she continued the ritual, speaking more words of protection, drawing more symbols in the air, he closed his eyes, the warmth of the sage smoke still swirling around him. And for the first time in weeks, he let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The darkness outside could not touch him now. He was safe. The woman finished the final chant and blew out the sage. The room, once heavy with tension, now felt light, the air clean, purified. She turned to her son, her face softening as she saw the relief in his eyes. "Go to bed," she whispered. "The night is over." As the boy climbed into bed, he could still feel the warmth of the ritual surrounding him. The fear, the shadows, they were gone. He knew, deep in his bones, that his mother's protection would hold. And as the woman watched over him, she knew this was just one night of many. But it was enough. It was always enough. Because as long as there were those who remembered the old ways, the rituals, the sacred practices, the darkness would never have the final say. The air was thick with the scent of herbs, and the flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on the walls of the small, humble room. Inside, the healer sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers stained with bright, powdered colors. Around her, the silence was almost sacred. She moved with a calm precision, as if every gesture was part of something much greater than herself. The sand before her was not just sand, it was a symbol, a prayer, a connection to the world beyond. Outside, the wind howled across the desert, a distant roar that carried with it the stories of ages long gone. Inside, the healer was creating something that could mend more than just broken bones. She was creating a pathway, an open door between this world and the next. The sand beneath her fingers seemed to pulse with life, alive with power. As her hands gently shaped the patterns, the room seemed to come alive with energy. Each stroke of her finger brought the picture into clearer focus, a figure, powerful and regal, emerging from the swirling colors. The pattern was intricate, beautiful, and meaningful. Every grain of sand, every curve, every shape had a purpose. And as she completed the final detail, the colors shimmered under the candlelight, almost as if the image was breathing. A patient sat at the edge of the room, watching with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He had come here with a broken spirit, the weight of his pain too heavy to carry any longer. His body had healed long ago, but something inside him had stayed fractured, raw. His mind, his heart, still hurt. And that's why he was here. He had heard stories of healers who could mend more than just flesh, who could mend souls. But as he watched the woman work, he felt a flicker of doubt. Could this really work? The healer finished her work and sat back. The sand painting was now complete. Her hands were still covered in sand, but it was the sand that had been transformed. No longer just dust from the desert floor, it was now a sacred thing, a prayer, a plea for healing. It had become something powerful, something that held the very essence of the land itself. The healer looked at the patient and nodded. "Come," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Sit in front of the painting." With a hesitant breath, the patient moved toward the sand painting, his feet shuffling across the floor. He had heard the stories, had heard that these paintings held more than just beauty, they held the power to heal, to change lives. But now, as he sat before the intricate design, he could feel the weight of the moment. It was as if he were staring into something ancient, something alive. The healer spoke softly, her voice a gentle hum in the stillness of the room. This is not just art. This is not just decoration. This is a prayer made real. As she spoke, she began to chant in the ancient tongue, her words flowing like a river, reaching into the heart of the patient's pain. The room seemed to hum, vibrating with the energy of the chant. The sand painting flickered, its colors shifting, as if it were alive, as if it were responding to the words of the healer. The patient felt a strange sensation wash over him. The weight of his sorrow seemed to lift, just a little. He closed his eyes, unsure of what was happening, but feeling something inside him stirring, as if his soul were waking from a long sleep. The healer continued her chant, her voice growing stronger with each word. The energy in the room became almost tangible, as if the air itself were charged with power. The sand painting shimmered, its colors brighter now, more vivid. And as the patient sat there, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that seemed to seep into his very bones. The pain, the sadness, the emptiness that had once consumed him, he felt it all slowly begin to melt away. The healing was not instantaneous, but it was real. It was like the sand painting had opened something inside of him, a door to a place of peace, a place where his soul could begin to heal. As the chanting faded, the room grew quiet once more. The healer stood and stepped back, her hand still holding the power of the ancient rituals. She had given him the path, the tools. But the real work was up to him. The patient stood slowly, his body feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing, hope. Hope that he could heal. Hope that the broken pieces inside of him could be put back together. He turned to the healer, his eyes filled with gratitude, but she was already turning away, her work done. The painting she had created, so much more than just sand, had done its job. It had healed a wound that was far deeper than anything the body could experience. And as he stepped out of the room, he could feel the weight of the world just a little bit lighter on his shoulders. Outside, the wind still howled. But now, for the first time in years, he didn't hear it as a threat. He heard it as a whisper of life, a promise that everything, could be healed. The sand painting, now just a memory in the dust, had done more than just cleanse his soul. It had reminded him of the power of the earth, the power of the sacred art that had been passed down through generations. In its simplicity, there was beauty. In its complexity, there was healing. And in the soft strokes of the healer's hands, there was a message: the spirit, like the earth itself, could be healed if we knew where to look. The patient left the room, but the feeling stayed with him, a warmth that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And somewhere, in the far distance, the wind whispered a quiet song of healing, carried on the same breeze that had touched the healer's hands. The land, with its sacred power, had spoken. And now, so had he. There was a quiet stillness in the desert air, one that seemed to hold its breath as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. In the distance, the faint hum of the earth could almost be heard, a soft vibration that carried the weight of ancient stories. Beneath the sky painted with streaks of crimson and purple, the Hopi people gathered in a sacred circle. Their eyes were lifted, not to the stars yet visible, but to a presence far greater than themselves, an unseen force that had guided their ancestors for generations. It wasn't a god in the traditional sense, not a single being to worship or fear. No, these were the Kachina spirits, guardians that walked the world unseen, their protective gaze watching over the Hopi people, keeping them safe from the darkness that threatened to creep in from the corners of the earth. In every corner of Hopi life, the Kachina spirits were a part of the fabric of their existence, woven into the stories they told, the songs they sang, and the ceremonies they held. The spirits were not distant, but intimately connected with the people, living alongside them, even if only in spirit. As the wind whispered through the canyon, it carried with it the stories of the Kachina, the protectors, the guardians, the ancestors who walked between worlds. On a night when the stars shone like millions of tiny eyes, a young girl stood outside her home, staring into the vast desert that stretched endlessly before her. She had heard the stories, the tales that her elders spoke in hushed tones. Her grandmother had told her of the Kachina spirits, of how they had saved her people in times of need, standing guard when the night grew too dark and the shadows too thick to bear. But tonight, standing alone in the open air, the girl felt something stir within her, a presence that seemed to call to her from the very earth beneath her feet. Her heart raced as she looked around, her eyes searching the horizon. There was no sound but the soft rustling of the wind through the sagebrush. Yet, in her chest, she could feel the weight of something ancient pressing against her, a force that seemed to pulse with life, just beyond the veil of her vision. She knew, deep down, that the Kachina spirits were with her. She could feel their presence, their watchful eyes keeping her safe, even in the stillness of the night. Her grandmother had spoken of the Kachina spirits often, telling her that they were not to be feared, but revered. They were protectors, sent to shield the Hopi from harm. In times of war, they had fought beside the people, ensuring that no enemy could come close. In times of illness, the Kachina had brought healing, guiding the hands of the medicine men and women. And in times of darkness, when the shadows seemed too long and the path too uncertain, the Kachina had been the light that showed the way. The girl's thoughts were interrupted as she heard a rustle behind her. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway of her home, was her grandmother. The old woman smiled gently, her eyes glinting in the fading light. "You feel it, don't you?" her grandmother asked, her voice soft and steady, as if she had known all along what the girl was experiencing. The girl nodded slowly, unable to find the words to express what she was feeling. "Those who walk the earth unseen," her grandmother continued, her voice a mere whisper now, "are the ones who will protect you when you cannot protect yourself. They are with us, always. And they will guard you as you walk your path, just as they have guarded our people for generations." The girl's heart swelled with something indescribable, part fear, part awe, part wonder. She felt both small and vast, as if she were part of something much larger than herself, a piece of a puzzle that had been put together long ago. The wind picked up again, swirling around her like a soft embrace. The Kachina were with her, guiding her, watching over her. As the girl stepped back into the warmth of her home, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "They are always with you." Those words had been passed down through countless generations, whispered like a prayer, a promise. In the days that followed, the girl could not shake the feeling of the Kachina's presence. It was subtle, like a shadow that lingered just at the edge of her vision, but it was there, a constant reminder that she was not alone. Every step she took, every choice she made, the Kachina spirits were watching, ensuring that she was safe. And when times grew difficult, when the world seemed uncertain, when she faced challenges too great to overcome on her own, she would remember the strength of the spirits who had stood by her ancestors, and she would find the courage to face whatever came her way. The Hopi people knew the Kachina spirits as both protectors and teachers. They were not just beings that kept the darkness at bay, but guides who helped the people navigate the complexities of life. In every dance, in every song, in every prayer, the spirits were honored. It was through these rituals that the people felt their connection to the Kachina, and through this connection, they drew strength, protection, and wisdom. For the Hopi, the Kachina spirits were not distant or unattainable. They were woven into the fabric of their lives, a reminder that the earth was alive with forces both seen and unseen. And when the darkness threatened, when the world seemed to close in, the Kachina were there, standing guard, protecting, guiding. The young girl grew up, but she never forgot that night, standing in the desert, feeling the presence of the spirits around her. She carried their protection with her always, passing on the stories, the rituals, the lessons of the Kachina to the next generation. The guardians of the Hopi were not just protectors of the people, they were protectors of the soul, of the spirit, and of the earth itself. And in their watchful eyes, the Hopi found the strength to endure, to thrive, and to carry on the traditions that had sustained them for countless generations. A chill ran through the night air, slicing through the warmth of the late summer evening. The wind whispered across the sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of the desert, dry and faintly metallic. Maria sat outside her small, quiet home on the outskirts of a Navajo community, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed into the distance. There was something uneasy about the stillness tonight, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, the stories she had grown up with, warnings passed down from generation to generation, beware of the skinwalkers. Maria had heard the tales, as every Navajo child had. But she had grown up in a world that felt far removed from the terrifying legends of the skinwalkers, the witches who could transform into wolves, coyotes, or even birds, stealing the skins of the creatures they wore to carry out their dark, twisted deeds. She thought those stories were just that, stories. Fables, meant to keep children in line, to teach them respect for the traditions of their ancestors. But now, sitting under the vast desert sky, Maria wasn't so sure anymore. In the years since she had returned to her homeland, after years of living away, the whispers around her community had started to change. The stories of skinwalkers had never truly gone away, but they were different now. They were darker, more urgent, as if the fear had shifted from legend to something far more real, more immediate. In the small towns that dotted the reservation, people spoke in hushed tones. People who never used to talk about skinwalkers were now warning their children, locking their doors early at night, avoiding the paths that wound deep into the desert. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. The skinwalkers were no longer just stories told to children in the dark corners of a room. They had become a real presence, a shadow on the edge of every conversation. Maria's uncle, Ben, a quiet man who had worked the land his whole life, had been one of the first to speak openly about it. She had seen him in the living room of her aunt's house, a fire crackling in the hearth, his face hard with the weight of something he could barely say aloud. "You can feel them out there," Ben had said, his voice low, rough with something he didn't want to admit. "Something's changed. I've heard things in the night, strange howling sounds. No coyote sounds like that. No wolf either." At first, Maria had brushed it off. There was always something strange about the desert at night, always something unsettling about the darkness. But Ben wasn't the type to speak in riddles. There was a quiet desperation in his voice, something that made Maria's heart flutter with unease. The stories had changed, too. In the past, the skinwalkers had been feared, yes, but they had been distant, creatures of another time, symbols of betrayal, evil, and vengeance. But now, the stories were different. Now, the skinwalkers were closer than ever. People talked about sightings, men and women seen in the desert, wandering in animal skins that didn't belong to them. A coyote following a car down a long, empty stretch of road. The eerie silence that would fall over the land before something unnatural happened. Maria had seen the change herself. She remembered the unease that had settled over her friends when they returned from a camping trip a few months ago. They hadn't spoken much of it afterward, but there was an air about them, a lingering fear they couldn't shake. They had gone into the desert to camp, to escape the noise of the world. But when they had returned, something was off. Their eyes were wide with a kind of terror Maria had never seen before. "We saw something," one of her friends had whispered, looking over her shoulder as if the skinwalkers were just behind them, waiting to strike. "Out there, in the hills." It was a person, but not. It moved wrong. Like it wasn't even human anymore. The fear in her friend's voice, the tremble in her hands, was enough to send a shiver down Maria's spine. She had tried to brush it off, but deep down, she couldn't escape the feeling that the stories were no longer confined to the past. The skinwalkers weren't just myths, they were becoming something real, something that had found its way back into the world of the living. Maria wasn't the only one who felt it. The elders, who had once told stories of skinwalkers in passing, now spoke of them with a heaviness that could not be ignored. They had seen it, too, the change in the land, in the air, in the way the people spoke. It was as if the spirits themselves were restless, as if something ancient and dangerous had begun to stir once again. One evening, after dinner, Maria sat with her grandmother on the porch, the sound of the crickets filling the air. She couldn't keep the questions inside anymore. "Grandma," Maria said, her voice soft, "are the skinwalkers real? Are they coming back?" Her grandmother was quiet for a long time, her eyes gazing out over the darkened landscape. Then, with a sigh, she spoke. "They were always real, Maria," her grandmother said quietly. "The stories are not just stories. They are warnings. And they come when the balance is disturbed, when the land is no longer respected." Maria felt a shiver run down her spine. It was a strange feeling, one she couldn't quite name. There was something about the way her grandmother spoke, something in the gravity of her words that made Maria believe. The skinwalkers were no longer just figures in the dark, things to scare children into obedience. They were becoming part of the present, an ominous shadow that crept closer with each passing day. In the months that followed, Maria couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching, something was waiting. The stories of the skinwalkers in her community had changed. They were no longer just folklore, they were a reality, slipping out from the past, finding their way into the present, their claws reaching into the future. And with it, the fear that had always been there, buried deep within the earth, began to surface once more. The night was darker than usual, the kind of night that seems to swallow everything whole. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the streets, and the wind carried an eerie, unsettling whisper. It was a quiet night, but something about the silence felt wrong. Emily walked home, her footsteps echoing through the empty alley. She had just finished her shift at the bookstore, and her mind wandered until something caught her eye. A figure in the distance. At first, it looked like a person, but as she squinted, she noticed how the figure moved. Unnatural. Jerky. Like it wasn't quite human. The figure's face was hidden, but she could tell it was watching her, its gaze burning through the darkness. Her heart raced, and every instinct told her to run, but she froze, caught in the strange, hypnotic pull of the figure's presence. It wasn't until the figure vanished into the shadows that Emily realized her breath had been held the entire time. The next morning, her mind kept racing back to that moment, to the terror she felt as the figure seemed to flicker in and out of sight, not quite of this world. It wasn't until she shared the story with a friend that the word skinwalker slipped from her lips. That night, as Emily tossed and turned in her bed, she realized something terrifying. The stories she had heard, the movies she had watched, the books she had read, they weren't just stories anymore. The skinwalkers, those dark, shape-shifting creatures from the ancient Navajo legends, had crossed the line from folklore into the very heart of popular media, and now, she was starting to believe that maybe there was more truth to those stories than she had ever dared to consider. Emily wasn't alone in this. Across the world, the legend of the skinwalker had made its way into the popular imagination, becoming a staple of horror movies, books, and even video games. In the quiet corners of late-night movie marathons and the flickering pages of horror novels, the skinwalker had become more than just a story. It had become a monster that people feared, a creature that slithered its way into the darkest recesses of our minds. Take, for instance, the countless movies that had tapped into this primal fear. From supernatural thrillers to full-blown horror flicks, skinwalkers had become the ultimate symbol of fear, betrayal, and the unknown. These movies portrayed the skinwalker as a twisted reflection of humanity, a thing that could wear the face of a loved one, a figure that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. Watching the skinwalker in these films was like staring into a mirror, only the reflection staring back at you wasn't your own. It was something far worse. In these films, the skinwalker wasn't just a shadow lurking in the distance, it was a predator. It could be anyone, anywhere. It was a master of disguise, of manipulation, and its power lay in its ability to make you doubt what was real. Was that woman in the kitchen your mother? Or was it something pretending to be her, something with a far darker purpose? The tension these films created was a knot in the stomach, a gnawing feeling that never fully let go. The fear was contagious, spreading through the screen like wildfire, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease that clung to the viewer long after the credits rolled. And then there were the books. From thrilling novels to spine-chilling anthologies, skinwalkers had found their way into the pages of some of the most terrifying stories ever written. In these books, The Skinwalker wasn't just a monster, it was a symbol. A symbol of the things we can never truly understand, of the dark forces that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. As readers turned the pages, they were drawn deeper into a world where the Skinwalker could be anyone, and no one was safe. With each chapter, the tension mounted, and the terror grew, until the reader was left questioning not just the fate of the characters, but their own safety in the world they inhabited. But the horror didn't stop with books and movies. In the world of video games, the Skinwalker had found a new home, where it could take on a life of its own. In the virtual landscapes of these games, players were no longer just observers, they were active participants in a world where the Skinwalker could appear at any moment. The creature stalked players through forests, fields, and abandoned towns, its grotesque form lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fear wasn't just something you read about or watched on a screen, it was something you felt in your gut as you moved through the game, your heart pounding with every footstep you took, unsure of whether you were walking into a trap. As these stories in popular media became more intense, more graphic, they brought with them a strange, unsettling question: what if these stories weren't just stories? What if, in some way, they were tapping into something real? The Skinwalker, once a figure of ancient myth, had evolved into a creature that felt as if it could exist anywhere, at any time. It wasn't just a monster from the past, it was something that could be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. For Emily, the lines between fiction and reality had begun to blur. The fear she once felt while watching these stories unfold on screen now felt like a tangible presence that followed her. She could no longer look at the night sky without thinking of the movies and books she had consumed, and wondering if the darkness held something far worse than she could see. The fear that once lived only in the pages of a book or the flickering images of a movie screen now seemed to have found its way into her own life. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside her window, every shadow in the corner of her eye made her wonder, what if? In the end, the Skinwalker wasn't just a monster of myth and legend. It was something more, it was a mirror, reflecting back at us the darkness we try to ignore. It was the fear that lives deep inside all of us, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what lurks just beyond our understanding. And as long as stories like these continue to spread, through movies, books, games, and whispers in the dark, those questions will never go away. They will only grow louder, until we can no longer tell where the story ends and reality begins. The old tape recorder crackled to life, spitting out static and distorted whispers. The investigator leaned closer, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls of the desolate canyon. "Did you hear that?" his partner asked, her voice barely a whisper. They both froze, ears straining against the oppressive silence of the desert night. The air felt heavy, electric, as if it were charged with something unseen yet palpable. The recorder hissed again, and then came a low, guttural sound, one that didn't belong to any human or animal they knew. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. This was no ordinary night. And whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. For decades, those brave, or foolish, enough to investigate the world of the unexplained have sought answers to the phenomenon of the Skinwalker. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and every piece of high-tech gear they could carry, they ventured into places most people wouldn't dare to tread. These weren't just ghost hunters or thrill seekers, they were people desperate to understand the unthinkable, chasing something that always seemed one step ahead, always just out of reach. The story started small. A rustle in the bushes. Tracks in the dirt that ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. But as investigators spent more nights out in the wilderness, the events became harder to dismiss. Animals behaving strangely, circling their camps as if under some unseen influence. Distant figures watching them from the edges of the light, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. It was one such night when a small group of researchers found themselves in the heart of Navajo territory. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying with it the unsettling cries of coyotes. They had been told not to come, warned by the locals that what they were chasing was not something to be disturbed. But curiosity is a powerful force, and so they stayed, cameras pointed into the darkness, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. But just as they began packing up, a noise broke through the quiet, a high-pitched wail, like the cry of a dying animal. It was close, too close. They shone their flashlights in the direction of the sound, only to see a figure dart between the rocks, impossibly fast. One of them swore they saw a face, pale and twisted, but it was gone before they could focus. The group decided to stay a little longer, despite the growing unease settling over them. The air turned cold, far colder than the desert night should have been, and the wind died down completely. That's when they noticed the smell, something foul, like decaying flesh. Then, a sound they couldn't explain, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling their camp. They tried calling out, but the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, the circling grew tighter, as if whatever it was wanted to close in. One of the researchers turned on an infrared camera, hoping to capture whatever was out there. What they saw made their blood run cold. Through the lens, a figure appeared, crouched low to the ground, its limbs contorted in ways no human could achieve. Its eyes reflected back at them, piercing and empty, and when it moved, it didn't run, it glided, as if its feet barely touched the earth. The video footage was later shown to experts, but no one could provide an explanation. Skeptics called it a hoax, claiming shadows and low-quality equipment created the illusion. But those who were there knew better. They had felt its presence, a bone-deep terror that no words could fully capture. Other investigations followed, each one adding another layer to the mystery. Some claimed to hear voices in the night, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Others reported their equipment malfunctioning the moment they stepped foot on sacred land. Cameras would freeze, batteries would drain, and strange symbols would appear on the screens, symbols that seemed to vanish when examined more closely. But the most chilling accounts came from those who believed they had been followed home. One investigator, after spending a week in a hotspot for skinwalker sightings, began noticing strange things in her apartment. Scratches appeared on her walls overnight, and her pets refused to enter certain rooms. She would wake up to the sound of footsteps in her hallway, but no one was there. Then, one night, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, its form shifting and flickering like a bad reception on an old TV. It was only there for a moment, but it was enough to make her leave the field forever. And yet, despite these terrifying experiences, the investigations continued. Some believed they were close to finding proof, something tangible that would finally explain what was happening. Others felt they were chasing a ghost, something that could never be captured or understood. The phenomenon of skinwalkers seemed to resist every attempt to document it, as if it thrived on remaining hidden. Those who tried to get too close often found themselves haunted, not just by what they had seen, but by what they couldn't explain. It was as if the skinwalkers knew they were being hunted, and they relished the game, toying with their pursuers like a predator playing with its prey. Even the most hardened skeptics admitted there was something strange about the stories, something that couldn't be brushed aside so easily. They pointed to the consistency of the accounts, the way people from vastly different backgrounds described the same eerie details, the glowing eyes, the guttural growls, the feeling of being watched. But for those who had been out there, who had stood in the darkness and felt the presence of something watching them, it wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was terrifying. The investigators knew they were risking more than their reputations every time they stepped into the unknown. They were risking their very sanity, their sense of safety in a world that suddenly seemed far darker and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And yet, they kept going, drawn by a need they couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the same need that drove the skinwalker itself, the need to remain in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the old storyteller's face. His eyes, glinting with wisdom and something unspoken, swept over the small group gathered around him. "There are those who say it's just a tale," he began, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of generations. "But tell me this, can you feel the air? How it thickens, how it clings to your skin. My grandfather always said, where stories linger, something is watching." The desert around them was still, unnervingly so. Not even the wind dared stir. The younger ones chuckled nervously, brushing off the elders' words as mere theatrics. Yet, when a faint howl cut through the night, more than one pair of eyes darted to the dark horizon. They wouldn't admit it, not aloud, but the thought crept in, what if? For centuries, stories have been told, some to explain the unexplainable, others to ward off danger. But among these tales, few walk the razor's edge between belief and skepticism like that of the Skinwalker. Is it a trick of the mind, a shadow cast too cleverly by the moonlight? Or is it something more, a glimpse into a world we're not meant to see? Skeptics argue for logic. They point to the absence of concrete evidence, to the lack of video footage that can't be explained away as coincidence or fraud. They say science has no room for shapeshifters, for beings that defy the laws of biology and physics. But science can't explain everything. Not the guttural, otherworldly sounds that have made hardened men freeze in fear. Not the eerie feeling that grips you when you hear footsteps behind you, only to turn and find nothing there. Then there are the believers, those who swear on their lives that they've seen something. Their accounts don't waver, even under scrutiny. A rancher speaks of livestock vanishing without a trace, their tracks disappearing as if lifted into the sky. A traveler recounts a figure with glowing eyes keeping pace with his car, its form morphing from animal to man before disappearing into the night. But belief comes at a cost. To believe is to accept that the world is not as it seems, that shadows might hide more than just the absence of light. It's to acknowledge that the comfort of rationality is a fragile shield, one that could shatter at any moment. One man, a schoolteacher in his late 40s, tells his story with a voice that trembles despite his best efforts. He remembers driving home late one night, the road empty except for the beams of his headlights. He saw it ahead, a coyote, standing still in the middle of the road. He honked, but it didn't move. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow. He swerved to avoid it, and as he passed, he glanced in the rearview mirror. It wasn't a coyote anymore. His voice falters as he describes what he saw, a figure, human-like but wrong, its limbs bent at impossible angles. It was watching him, its head cocked as though curious. He sped away, refusing to look again. For weeks after, he felt like he was being followed. Doors would creak open on their own. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any. He doesn't tell the story often, but when he does, his eyes glisten with the memory of fear. Skeptics would say it was his mind playing tricks on him, a moment of tiredness warping his perception. And maybe it was. But that doesn't explain why his dog refused to leave the house for days after, barking at something no one else could see. Belief isn't just about what you see, it's about what you feel. It's in the way your chest tightens when you hear a noise you can't explain. It's in the way your skin prickles when you sense you're not alone. For some, that feeling is enough. For others, it's not. A woman who grew up on the reservation recalls her grandmother's warning, never speak of them by name, and never go outside after dark if you hear your name being called. She always thought it was just an old superstition, something meant to keep children in line. But one night, she heard it, her name, whispered on the wind. She stayed inside, heart pounding, until dawn. When she stepped outside, she found the tracks, large, clawed, and circling her home. Was it an animal? A prank? She doesn't know. What she does know is the fear that gripped her, the certainty that whatever called her name wasn't human. The debate between belief and skepticism often feels like a battle, each side armed with its own arsenal of arguments. But for those caught in the middle, those who've heard, seen, or felt something they can't explain, it's not about choosing a side. It's about living with the possibility, the gnawing uncertainty that perhaps the world is stranger than we can comprehend. Even those who call themselves skeptics admit to feeling uneasy when they hear the stories. A scientist, rational to his core, once attended a gathering where the elders shared their experiences. He didn't believe a word of it, not at first. But as the night wore on, as the firelight flickered and the stories grew darker, he felt it, the chill in the air, the sense of being watched. He left before the stories ended, but he couldn't shake the feeling. He doesn't talk about that night much, only to say that sometimes, not everything can be measured or tested. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the power of the skinwalker lies not in its existence, but in its ability to make us question what we think we know. To remind us that for all our advancements, for all our logic and reason, there are still things that go bump in the night. The fire had burned low, the storyteller's words hanging heavy in the air. No one spoke, the weight of the stories pressing down on them like the night itself. And as they stared into the embers, each one wondered the same thing. What if? The moon hung low, casting a silver glow over the quiet landscape, as if watching, waiting. A soft rustle in the trees broke the silence, and for a moment, the air felt thick with something ancient. Something otherworldly. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it, a presence, shifting, changing. The figure you thought you saw out of the corner of your eye wasn't quite what it seemed. It was always something more, something hidden beneath layers of skin, of form, of illusion. What if everything you thought you knew about the world, about people, animals, and even spirits, was wrong? What if behind every creature, there was something darker, older, more terrifying? And what if that darkness could wear any face it wished? Across the world, there are whispers of beings who walk between two worlds, slipping in and out of forms. Some are called skinwalkers. Some are called wargs, or werewolves, or selkies. The names change, but the fear, the tension, the stories are strikingly similar. These are not mere creatures of myth, they are the stuff of nightmares, the kind that make your skin crawl and your heart race in the dead of night. In the icy reaches of Europe, the legend of the werewolf has haunted the hearts of villagers for centuries. On cold, moonlit nights, it's said that ordinary men and women can transform into wolves, their bodies contorting in grotesque, unnatural ways. The howl of a wolf in the distance is enough to send the bravest souls running for cover, for no one knows whether it's an animal or a human cursed to wander the earth in a beast's skin. The idea of a person shedding their humanity, becoming a savage animal, is not so different from the stories told by the Navajo of the skinwalker, a man or woman who can wear the skin of an animal and become it. But while the Navajo stories are steeped in the darkness of the spirit world, the European tales of werewolves carry with them a sense of tragic inevitability. There's always a curse, one that can't be escaped, one that makes the transformation feel less like power and more like punishment. Then there's the selkie, a creature from the cold waters of the north, whose skin is said to be a seal's. It is said that a selkie can shed its seal skin and walk as a woman on land, but if her skin is taken from her, she can never return to the sea. The shape-shifting power of the selkie is different from that of a skinwalker, softer, more tragic, but it too comes with a cost. The selkie may long for the sea, but she is forever caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. It's a painful kind of transformation, one that speaks to the isolation and yearning within the human soul. And further east, in the ancient lands of Japan, there are the stories of the shape-shifting fox, or kitsune. Known for their intelligence and magical abilities, kitsune are believed to have the power to transform into beautiful women, often seducing men and weaving their fates in ways they don't understand. Unlike the skinwalker, who uses transformation for power and malevolence, the kitsune is often a trickster, a being who plays with the boundaries between good and evil. But the act of changing form is the same, an ability to slip into a new identity, to wear the skin of another being, to deceive the world around them. The kitsune's power is one of seduction and manipulation, and it often leaves the human victim forever changed, unable to fully comprehend the forces that have shaped their fate. These legends, though varied in their details, all carry with them a shared understanding. The boundary between the human and the animal is thin, and some beings can cross it at will. What is it about this idea, the transformation from one form to another, that so grips the human imagination? What is it about the shapeshifter that both terrifies and fascinates us? Maybe it's the idea of control, or the loss of it. Maybe it's the fear that the skin we wear, the identity we hold, can be shed, leaving us vulnerable to something that's no longer us. In Central America, the stories of the Nahual from the Mayan and Aztec cultures mirror these shapeshifter legends, weaving a similar thread of fear and fascination. The Nahual is said to be a person with the ability to transform into an animal, often a jaguar, a creature revered for its power and fearsome presence. Like the skinwalker, the Nawal is seen as a figure who stands on the edge of two worlds, the human and the animal, the spiritual and the physical. In some stories, the Nawal is a healer, a protector. In others, it is a dark force, an agent of evil whose very nature is to cross boundaries and break taboos. The Nawal's transformation is not just a physical act, it is also a spiritual one, a bending of reality itself. And even in the African myths, there are whispers of shapeshifting beings, the were-hyena, whose form can change from human to hyena, taking on the beast's predatory nature. The transformation is not just a change of skin, it is a change of soul, a dark embrace of the animal's instincts and hunger. These myths speak of a fear that transcends culture, a fear that speaks to our primal fears of the wild and the untamed. Each culture, each myth, speaks to the same idea: transformation is a powerful thing. It can be a gift or a curse, a tool for survival or a mark of shame. It brings both freedom and confinement, power and danger. The skinwalker, the werewolf, the kitsune, the Nawal, they are all symbols of this primal fear. And though the names and details differ, the core of the myth remains the same. There is something in all of us that longs to be free from the confines of our human skin, and yet there is something terrifying about that freedom. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, the thought lingers: what would it feel like to slip out of yourself, to leave your human skin behind and become something else? And as the shadows stretch long across the ground, you wonder, what would you become? The air is thick with tension as the fire crackles softly in the center of the camp. Around it, elders whisper ancient words, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. The flickering shadows on their faces dance like spirits, watchful, powerful. There's a cold wind stirring the trees, but it's not the chill of winter. It's something else, something older, more dangerous, and unseen. You don't know if it's the stories the elders told you as a child, or something deeper, something primal in the bones that makes the hair on your neck stand up. But you can feel it, the magic, the power. And you're not sure if it's your own imagination playing tricks, or if something far darker is at work. In the heart of the vast and wild lands of the Native American tribes, witchcraft is not just a belief, it's a reality. It's an ancient practice that ties people to the earth, the sky, and the spirits who walk between. But it isn't just confined to one tribe or one place. The belief in magic, in witches, and beings who can shape the world with a word or a gesture, these practices spread across tribes, intertwining and blurring lines. The boundaries between right and wrong, good and evil, spirit and flesh are more delicate than you'd think. And in the darkness of the night, those boundaries are often crossed. The Navajo speak of witches, but they aren't the only ones. The Hopi have their own stories, legends of powerful shamans who could call upon the elements to do their bidding. But it's not just the power of the earth and wind they could control, it's the very essence of life itself. They say the Hopi witch could call upon the spirits of the dead, walking between worlds with ease. But beware, for the same power that could heal could also curse. A witch who could summon rain could also bring drought. A healer who could save a life could also steal one. The power was a gift, but it came with a terrible price. Across the plains, the Sioux have their own version of magic. They call it medicine, and the term itself can mean both healing and harm. A Sioux medicine person can call upon the spirits of animals, birds, and ancestors. The wisdom of the buffalo could be theirs to guide them, the hawk's keen sight could sharpen their minds, and the strength of the bear could empower them. But they too must be careful, for there is a fine line between using magic for the good of the people and using it for personal gain. The Sioux know well that the spirits are not to be trifled with. Those who seek to use the medicine for harm risk bringing the wrath of the spirits down upon them. And when that happens, there's no escaping it. You can't outrun the ghosts of those you've wronged. But it wasn't just the power of the elements or the spirits that these witches possessed. In many tribes, magic was woven into the very fabric of life. The Apache, for example, were known for their shape-shifting practices. Like the skinwalkers of the Navajo, the Apache witches could transform themselves into animals, taking on the strength of the coyote or the stealth of the owl. But the shape-shifting wasn't always a gift, it could be a curse. Those who used the magic for evil would be trapped in their animal forms, unable to return to their human selves. They were lost to the world, wandering the earth as beasts, with only a shred of their human souls remaining. In the heart of the Great Plains, the Cheyenne have their own practices that mirror the magic of their neighbors. They speak of medicine bundles, sacred objects imbued with the power to protect, to heal, or to curse. These bundles were carried by warriors, shamans, and leaders, each one containing sacred herbs, animal bones, and sacred symbols. But the power of the bundle was not solely in the objects it contained, it was in the connection between the bearer and the spirits that guided them. If you treated the bundle with respect, it would protect you. If you disrespected it, it would bring harm. It was a power that could be wielded for good or evil, and the consequences of your choices were always far-reaching. And then, there are the Cree. Far to the north, the Cree hold a deep understanding of the spiritual world, one that is rooted in the earth itself. The Cree shamans are said to be able to walk between the physical and spiritual realms, talking to animals, the wind, the sky, and the stars. They can call upon the forces of nature, asking for guidance and power. But this connection to the spirits is not something to be taken lightly. The Cree know that the magic they wield comes from a place of respect and balance with the natural world. A shaman who goes against this balance, using their power to harm or control, will find that the forces they summon will turn against them. The spirits are not bound to serve, they are to be honored. To break that bond is to bring disaster. Each of these tribes, with their own versions of witchcraft, their own beliefs and practices, speaks to the same underlying truth: magic is a force of nature. It is neither good nor evil in itself, but the way it is used shapes its effect on the world. Whether it is the Skinwalkers of the Navajo, the shape-shifting witches of the Apache, the medicine men of the Sioux, or the shamanic practices of the Cree and Cheyenne, the connection to the spirit world is one that can be both a blessing and a curse. The power to heal, to protect, and to control the forces of nature is an incredible gift, but it is also a dangerous one. There is something raw and unsettling about the idea of witchcraft in Native American culture. It isn't the kind of magic you read about in fairy tales, where a flick of the wrist can change everything. No, this is power forged in the heart of the earth, shaped by centuries of wisdom, loss, and survival. It is a force that moves through the very veins of the people, coursing with life and death. It isn't something you can ever truly understand unless you've stood in the dark of the night, when the wind howls, and the spirits are near, watching, waiting. It's a power that touches the soul, and once you've felt it, you can never forget it. The flames flicker in the dimming light, casting shadows on faces that look both terrified and determined. The crackling fire sounds almost like whispers, voices from the past, carrying a warning. In the air, there's an unmistakable scent of fear, like the lingering stench of something wrong, something that no one can take back. A woman is chained to a post, her eyes wild, her body shaking. The crowd murmurs, the tension rising. Accusations are thrown at her, each word like a stone, sinking deep into her soul. Witch, they shout, their eyes blazing with righteous fury. The ground beneath her feet feels as if it's pulling her into the earth, dragging her toward a fate she can't escape. Across the ocean, hundreds of years ago, the same scenes played out, but in a different place, a different time. The smell of smoke hangs thick in the air, the sound of a woman's screams echoing in the cold stone chambers of an unfamiliar town. Her hands are bound, her body bruised, but it's the fear in her eyes that tells the real story. She doesn't even know what she's being accused of anymore. Witchcraft, they say, like a chant. And that word alone is enough to strip away her humanity, to turn her from a mother, a sister, a daughter, into a monster in their eyes. She's one of them. She has to be. There's no other explanation for the strange events, the inexplicable deaths, the unexplained illnesses. They look at her, and they see nothing but guilt, even though she hasn't spoken a word in her defense. She's already guilty the moment they laid their eyes on her, witch hunts. They have taken many forms, burned through many cultures, and left scars that run deep into history. Yet, the parallels between the European witch trials and the Navajo witch hunts stand out sharply. Both marked by fear, suspicion, and the relentless pursuit of an enemy that seemed both invisible and omnipresent. These two events cut into the fabric of human nature, revealing the darker side of society. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe erupted in a frenzy of witch trials, the flames of paranoia consuming villages and towns. People were accused of witchcraft for reasons as trivial as the misfortune of a neighbor, an unexplained illness, or an unexplainable act. Women, especially, were the primary targets. Their bodies, often seen as vessels of temptation, were marked as the perfect medium for witchcraft, making them prime candidates for accusation. It didn't matter if a woman had spent her life caring for others or tending to her children. If something unexplainable happened, she could be the first to be blamed. The trials were vicious, and the methods to extract confessions cruel. Torture, isolation, and fear led to confessions, but in many cases, those confessions were nothing more than a survival mechanism in a world that demanded blood. The Navajo witch hunts, on the other hand, did not take place in the same mass frenzy of public trials, but their own form of witchcraft persecution carried an equally terrifying weight. In the Navajo culture, witches, often referred to as Yinaldlushii, or skinwalkers, are believed to possess dark powers. They are said to be able to transform into animals, control the minds of others, and bring misfortune. These witches, unlike the isolated European figure, were not just feared, they were hunted. The Navajo believed that witches could easily infiltrate their communities, using their powers to cause illness, death, or destruction. Trust was fragile, and suspicion hung like a storm cloud over every gathering. The difference, however, lies in how the two cultures approached the hunt. In Europe, the accusations were largely driven by outsiders, by those who had power in the community, the clergy, the rulers, or those who stood to gain from a victim's downfall. The witch trials were organized, structured, and very public. For the Navajo, it wasn't a formalized process. Instead, it was more personal. It was an act of revenge, often conducted in secret. People in the community could find themselves marked as witches by personal grudges, jealousies, or misunderstandings. The hunter didn't need an official title, they simply had to be someone who feared the witch's power or wanted to stop it. In both cases, the results were horrifying. The European witches were burned at the stake, drowned, or tortured until they confessed to crimes they may not have committed. But the Navajo witch hunts were no less brutal. Witches were hunted down in the desert, often by families or individuals who believed that their very survival was at risk. In some cases, the accused were beaten, and in extreme cases, killed, without a chance to defend themselves. It was a brutal act, driven by desperation and fear. The line between justice and vengeance blurred until there was nothing left but bodies in the sand. But what truly links these two witch hunts is not the methods of persecution, but the deep-seated fear that underpinned them. Fear of the unknown, of things that could not be explained. Fear of the power that one person could wield over another. The trials in Europe and the witch hunts in the Navajo culture both came from a place of ignorance, but also from the desire to protect the community. People were afraid of what they couldn't understand, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to rid themselves of that fear, even if it meant turning on each other. In both cases, women, especially, became the symbol of that fear. The witch was a woman who possessed the knowledge of the ancient, the mystical, the forbidden. She was the outcast, the one who could heal or harm with a whispered word or the touch of her hand. Her power made her both revered and reviled. Whether she was a European healer, a midwife, or a village outcast, she carried the weight of the community's darkest fears. The more mysterious she was, the more dangerous she became in the eyes of those who could not understand her. There's a certain heartbreak in the shared history of these witch hunts, the realization that fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding have been at the root of so much pain. What makes a person a witch? How does one separate truth from lie, innocence from guilt? The answer is often far more complex than the mobs who cast their judgment want to admit. In the end, both the European witch trials and the Navajo witch hunts reveal the same painful truth. When fear takes hold, it turns neighbors into enemies, friends into traitors, and leaves scars that can last for generations. The bloodshed, the pain, the loss, these are the ghosts that haunt the memories of those who lived through it. They are the memories that ripple through time, reminding us of how fragile trust can be and how easily it can be shattered by fear. A soft, distant wind carries a whisper across the desert, rustling the dry brush. The sky, painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun begins to set, holds a quiet stillness. Beneath the beauty, there's an unspoken understanding, one that has been passed down for generations. The stories of the Navajo and Hopi are not just tales, they are the lifeblood of a people, their culture, their sacred traditions, and their deep connection to the earth. But as the stories are shared, there's something more than just words, there's an undeniable presence that can't be captured or contained. It lingers, waiting. When someone speaks of these ancient traditions, the weight of history presses down, heavy and real. The danger of telling these stories carelessly is that they can slip into something else entirely, something that strips away their meaning, their depth, their reverence. For too long, outsiders have taken the myths and rituals of the Navajo and Hopi, borrowing them like borrowed clothes that don't quite fit, using them without understanding the sacredness that lies within. The stories were never meant to be entertainment, nor were they created to serve the curiosity of those who sought them without respect. They were born of the earth, from the very souls of those who lived close to the land, and they carried lessons and warnings meant to protect and guide. There's a chill in the air as the sun disappears behind the horizon, a reminder that something is always watching. The Navajo and Hopi see the world through a lens forged from respect and spiritual harmony. Their beliefs are not something to be bought and sold, nor something to be twisted into something easily consumed. These are sacred beliefs, truths that shape a people's identity, their relationships with the earth, and with each other. The skinwalkers, the trickster spirits, the sacredness of the land, it's all part of something much greater. It's not a mystery to be solved or a horror to be feared, but a piece of the living, breathing history of a culture that deserves respect. As these stories move beyond the boundaries of the Navajo and Hopi communities, something shifts. Their powerful symbolism begins to twist into something else entirely. What was once a story of transformation and consequence now becomes the fodder for thrill seekers, horror fans, and storytellers who see only the surface. The skinwalker, once a terrifying and complex being, is reduced to a figure of mystery and fear, an archetype used to shock or entertain. The sacred act of transformation, of changing from human to animal, is cheapened, turned into a commodity for anyone willing to buy the ticket. But behind every tale, there's a history of loss, of survival, and of painful, enduring truths. A young man sits at the edge of a fire, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. He tells a story, his voice low, every word measured. He speaks of the lessons taught by his ancestors, of how they knew the land and the spirits within it. But then there's a shift in the story, a subtle difference from how he was taught. His words change, his tone grows harsher. The story is no longer about respect, it's about fear. The lines blur between fact and fiction, between what should remain sacred and what can be shared. In his telling, there is no acknowledgement of the responsibility that comes with the story, the heavy weight of generations that should never be forgotten. But the harm doesn't always come from ignorance. Sometimes, it comes from those who know better but choose to ignore the boundaries. The Navajo and Hopi beliefs are not for the taking, and the danger lies in the act of commodifying something that was never meant to be a product. These cultures do not belong to anyone but those who have inherited them, who have carried them through the centuries, keeping them alive with every breath. When outsiders take these stories and twist them for their own gain, whether in books, movies, or performances, they lose something essential. The soul of the story is ripped away, leaving only fragments behind. It's not just about appropriation, it's about connection. There's a reason why the Navajo and Hopi have always been protective of their stories, their ceremonies, their ways. They understand the deep power that these beliefs hold. They know that words are not just words, they are living entities, breathing with the energy of everything they have witnessed. The danger of misusing them is more than just disrespect, it's a violation of something ancient and irreplaceable. A person who tells a story without understanding its weight does not just misinform, they rob others of the opportunity to truly see it for what it is. The connections are broken. The wisdom is lost. There is an intensity in the way the Navajo and Hopi approach storytelling. When they speak of the Skinwalker, it is not as a mere figure of terror, but as a cautionary symbol. It is about the darkness that comes when someone turns against their own people, when they let their soul become twisted by greed or malice. It is a warning, not an entertainment piece. There is a lesson hidden in the shadows of the Skinwalker, but that lesson is lost when the story is stolen and warped into something that suits a different agenda. The words, once sacred, become hollow echoes of what they were meant to be. When you tell these stories, when you step into a world that is not your own, you must carry with you the weight of that responsibility. You must tread carefully, with reverence. To borrow from the Navajo and Hopi traditions without understanding is to disregard their essence. These stories are not your stories to change or claim. They belong to those who live with them, breathe them, and honor them every day. The stories are alive, and they demand respect. You cannot pick up pieces of them and discard what you do not understand. In the end, there's a quiet understanding that comes with acknowledging the sacredness of these beliefs. It is the same understanding that the elders carry when they speak of the past. It is the same understanding that fills the night air with the weight of the world. It is not for us to take, to claim, or to distort. It is for us to listen, to learn, and to recognize the beauty of a culture that has thrived through the darkest of times, holding onto its stories with pride and reverence. And as the last embers of the fire flicker and die, there is nothing left but silence, a silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. A cold shiver runs down your spine when you hear the term Skinwalker spoken aloud. The very word evokes images of twisted figures lurking in the shadows, of creatures that slither through the darkness, hungry for vengeance. It's a name whispered in fear, used to send chills down the spine of anyone who dares to question its meaning. But as the story unfolds, you begin to realize something deeply unsettling. The true meaning of Skinwalkers has been lost, mangled beyond recognition, twisted into something horrific by those who have no understanding of its sacred roots. In the darkness of the night, when the wind howls through the trees, it's easy to imagine a Skinwalker as a monster. The stories told by non-native sources have painted them as beings of pure evil, shapeshifters who wear the skins of animals, preying on the innocent with malicious intent. The images are vivid: a man, his face contorted into something monstrous, wearing the pelt of a wolf, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, inhuman light. They have become bogeymen, figures of fear meant to haunt nightmares. But this misrepresentation isn't just misleading, it's a distortion of something sacred, a sacredness that has existed long before those who seek to profit from fear could even begin to understand. The truth of the Skinwalker lies far deeper than the myths spread by those looking for a good scare. Skinwalkers are not just monsters, they are complex, multifaceted figures woven into the very fabric of Navajo spirituality. To the Navajo, the Skinwalker is a deeply feared and dangerous individual, but not in the sense that outsiders would like to believe. The Skinwalker is someone who has chosen to walk a dark path, someone who has taken the power of transformation to commit terrible deeds. But that power, and the choice to wield it, is not one to be taken lightly. It is not about pure evil for the sake of evil. It is about the consequences of a soul lost to the darkness within. When outsiders talk about Skinwalkers, they speak of the flesh they wear, the animal skins that cloak them as they move between the world of men and the world of animals. But the truth is more complicated. The Skinwalker is not just a shapeshifter, they are a symbol of moral corruption. The ability to transform into another being is not a gift, it's a curse, a reflection of a life that has veered far off the path of balance and harmony that the Navajo hold dear. It is a power that comes at a great cost, a cost that many will never fully understand. The media, the storytellers, the authors, all have twisted the narrative. The myth of the Skinwalker has been hijacked, used to sell stories, movies, and books. The desire for something sensational has overshadowed the deeper, more meaningful essence of the tale. What was once a tale of deep spiritual significance is now reduced to mere spectacle. But every time the skinwalker is turned into a monster, something is lost, something sacred, something profound. As the stories grow louder and more exaggerated, the truth becomes buried under a mountain of lies. People begin to think of skinwalkers as creatures of pure malice, as demons who feast on the suffering of others. The essence of who they truly are, human beings who have chosen to walk a dangerous path, is erased in favor of the more frightening image. Non-native sources, hungry for the thrill of fear, strip away the humanity that makes the tale so compelling. They reduce it to a mere horror story, to a simple villain that can be easily understood and feared. But in doing so, they miss the point entirely. They forget that skinwalkers are not born from an insatiable thirst for blood or destruction. They are created from a life of choices, choices that lead a person down a dark and twisted road. The skinwalker, in the eyes of the Navajo, is someone who has abandoned their community, their beliefs, and their ties to the sacred. They are no longer part of the balance that sustains the world. And it is that sense of disconnection, that sense of isolation, that makes them dangerous, not just to others, but to themselves. Their transformation is not a thrill, it is a curse, a punishment, a reflection of a life lost to darkness. The problem arises when those who don't understand take these stories, twist them, and use them to further their own agendas. They transform a cautionary tale into a spectacle, turning something sacred into something cheap. They portray the skinwalker as a monster, a creature to be feared and hunted, when in reality, they are a tragic symbol of human frailty. The skinwalker represents a person who has given in to the worst parts of themselves, and that is a story worth telling, not to scare, but to reflect. It's a reminder of the consequences of our actions, a lesson in the power of choice and the dangers of losing ourselves along the way. But it's not just the skinwalker myth that has suffered at the hands of non-native storytellers. The entire worldview of the Navajo and their beliefs have been distorted and misunderstood. The sacredness of the skinwalker, the reverence for nature, and the deep spiritual connection to the world around them, all of it is lost when it's boiled down to a simple story of terror. What outsiders see as a monster is really a cautionary figure, a reminder of what happens when balance is lost. And the irony lies in the fact that, in their desperate need to create horror, they fail to recognize the deeper horror of what it means to be disconnected, to lose sight of the sacred ties that bind us to the earth. In the end, the real monster is not the skinwalker at all, but the way in which their story has been hijacked. The true horror is not the transformation from man to beast, but the transformation of a deeply spiritual being into a mere shadow, a faceless figure that exists only to be feared. The skinwalker is not just a monster, they are a symbol, a reminder, a warning. And when we choose to ignore that, when we choose to reduce them to nothing more than a scary story, we erase the lessons that come with them. The price of that erasure is steep, and we pay it every time we misrepresent something sacred. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Beneath the blanket of stars, the wind carried whispers, an echo of something ancient, something that had been passed down through generations, shrouded in mystery and fear. There are those who claim to have seen the shape-shifting through the shadows, the eyes gleaming with something wild and untamed. They speak of creatures that are both human and animal, split between two worlds, forever caught in a liminal space where reality and myth blur. But as you listen closely, you begin to realize that the stories of skinwalkers are not just tales told to frighten, but a window into something far deeper, something both sacred and terrifying, woven into the fabric of a culture and its beliefs. The line between myth and reality isn't as clear-cut as many would like to think. It's not always black and white. For those outside the Navajo culture, skinwalkers are often reduced to nothing more than folklore, figures that lurk in the corners of a campfire story, meant to send chills down your spine. But for the Navajo, the skinwalker is not simply a ghost story, they are part of a larger spiritual belief system, woven into the very core of their worldview. To reduce them to mere myth is to ignore the context in which they exist, the context that gives them meaning, significance, and depth. In the Navajo way of thinking, the boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural are not rigid. The two are intertwined, constantly shifting, moving in and out of each other. Everything is connected, the earth, the animals, the spirits, and humans. The skinwalker, in this sense, is not just a figure of terror. They are a reflection of the complexity of human nature and the consequences of losing one's way. To the Navajo, the skinwalker is a tragic figure, a person who has chosen to step outside the sacred balance of the world and embrace the darkness within themselves. They are not born of evil, but of choices that turn them away from the harmony that sustains life. The myth, then, is not merely a cautionary tale. It is a spiritual lesson about balance, respect, and the consequences of abandoning one's responsibilities. The skinwalker is a reminder that when a person strays too far from the path, when they abandon their community and their traditions, they risk losing their humanity in the process. It's a warning, not just about power, but about the corruption of the soul. But how can we, outside the Navajo culture, truly understand such a figure? How do we make sense of a being that can transform, that straddles the boundary between human and animal, between the physical and the spiritual? It's difficult, if not impossible, to grasp fully, because we are not raised with the same understanding, the same connection to the land and the spirits. To us, the idea of a person transforming into an animal feels foreign, something that belongs to the realm of fantasy, of nightmares. But for the Navajo, it is a reality that exists within the framework of their spiritual beliefs, a reality that is grounded in the experiences and teachings of their ancestors. Yet even in the Navajo world, the skinwalker is not something to be taken lightly. They are not just characters in a myth, but real threats to the spiritual and physical well-being of the community. The practice of witchcraft, which skinwalkers are believed to engage in, is not something that is glorified. It is a dangerous and destructive path, one that comes with heavy consequences. To walk the path of a skinwalker is to forsake everything that makes you human. It is to embrace a darkness that ultimately consumes you. And so, while the skinwalker may exist within the cultural context of the Navajo, their story is also one of tragedy, of the loss of the self. The challenge for outsiders, then, is not just in understanding the skinwalker, but in seeing them within the context of the Navajo way of life. When the stories are told through the lens of fear and sensationalism, when they are reduced to mere horror tales, the deeper meaning is lost. The skinwalker becomes a monster, a creature of pure malice. But in the Navajo understanding, the skinwalker is not born of evil for the sake of evil. They are born of human choices that lead to destruction. They are a reflection of the darker side of human nature, the part that, if not kept in check, can tear apart the very fabric of a community. It is easy, from the outside, to dismiss the skinwalker as nothing more than a tale of the supernatural, something that can be easily explained away or ignored. But that would be a mistake. For the Navajo, the skinwalker represents a deep spiritual truth, that the balance of the world is fragile, and that when one part of the whole is disturbed, everything else begins to unravel. To understand the skinwalker is to understand the deep connection between people, animals, and the earth, the recognition that all life is sacred and interdependent. The line between myth and reality is not as clear-cut as it seems. In the case of the skinwalker, it is not a simple matter of separating fact from fiction. The skinwalker is both myth and reality, both a figure of terror and a symbol of spiritual truth. To understand them fully, we must look beyond the surface, beyond the fear and the sensationalism, and see them for what they truly are, a reflection of the complex and often tragic choices that define human existence. It is a lesson that can only be understood within the context of the culture from which it arises, a culture that recognizes the power of transformation, but also the dangers that come with it. And so, as the night grows deeper, and the whispers on the wind grow fainter, the line between myth and reality becomes less distinct. The skinwalker, in all their terrifying mystery, is a reminder of something much larger, something that transcends the boundaries of fear and superstition, reaching into the very heart of what it means to be human. The wind howls through the jagged peaks, carrying with it an ancient whisper, a sound almost human, but not quite. It weaves through the crags and valleys, brushing the stones with an unspoken language that only the land seems to understand. The mountains, old as time itself, stand sentinel over the desert below. Their peaks, often hidden in mist, are the kind of places where you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down on you, where the air is thick with secrets too old to be spoken. This is where the stories begin, stories of skinwalkers, creatures who shift between human and animal, and whose existence is inextricably linked to these sacred lands. The Navajo people have long whispered of these mountains, speaking of their power, their mystery, their darkness. These peaks, towering over the desert like ancient sentinels, are not just geographical features. They are sacred, imbued with deep spiritual significance. The landscape itself holds the stories of their people, etched into the rock and carried by the wind. There is a sense, deep in the bones of those who walk these lands, that the mountains know something, that they guard something precious, something dangerous. And that's where the skinwalkers come in. It is in these mountains where the line between myth and reality begins to blur. The peaks are more than just a backdrop to the stories, they are a part of the story itself. The legends say that to venture too far into the heart of these sacred mountains is to risk encountering the spirit of a skinwalker, a person who has chosen to walk the path of darkness, to transform into something other, something terrifying. The mountains are where the veil between worlds is thin, where the balance between the human and the animal is precarious. When the night falls, and the stars blanket the sky in their cold, glittering array, the mountains take on a different shape. They seem to pulse with a quiet energy, a hum that fills the air. The Navajo believe that the skinwalkers, these twisted souls who have given up their humanity in exchange for power, roam these lands. It is said that they are drawn to the mountains, to the energy that pulses through the earth. There is something about the geography, the jagged edges, the hidden caves, the deep, shadowed valleys, that calls to them. It is as if the land itself is a living thing, a creature that remembers and watches, that holds secrets in its bones and whispers them only to those brave enough to listen. There is a strange, unnerving beauty to the way the mountains seem to rise up from the earth, as if they have been sculpted by forces far greater than mere wind and rain. Their rough surfaces are carved with grooves and crevices, as though they bear the scars of ancient battles. Some say the mountains were made by the gods themselves, and that the skinwalkers, these once human beings who now walk in the form of wolves, bears, and coyotes, are somehow tied to these very rocks. The earth, the air, the sky, it's all connected in ways that are beyond understanding, a tangled web of spirit and nature that can neither be explained nor ignored. There are those who have ventured too close to these sacred peaks, those who sought to uncover the truth behind the legends, and they have never returned. The mountains, it seems, protect their secrets fiercely. The stories tell of travelers who heard the haunting howls of wolves echoing through the cliffs, only to discover that the wolves were not wolves at all, but men, twisted by the power of the mountains. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to shift, leading them deeper into the heart of the mountains, where the air grew thick with something darker, something sinister. There was no way out, no way to escape the eyes that watched from the shadows. But it is not just the danger that makes the mountains sacred. It's the knowledge that they hold, the ancient wisdom passed down through generations, that makes them so powerful. The Navajo believed that the skinwalkers, when they first began to walk the path of transformation, did so in these mountains. They sought the power that could only be found in the land itself, power that would allow them to shed their human skin and assume the form of animals. But that power came at a price. It came with the loss of their soul, with the abandonment of everything that made them human. The mountains, sacred as they are not a place for the faint of heart. They are not a place for those who do not understand the cost of power. It's said that the mountains hold the memory of every person who has walked them, every soul that has ventured into their depths, searching for something, whether it be truth, power, or simply a way out. Some say that if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers of those who have come before, their voices carried on the wind. And if you listen even more closely, you might hear the cries of those who have lost themselves to the mountains, to the dark powers that lie hidden within their rocky walls. The skinwalkers are a part of that history, a part of the land itself. They are bound to the mountains, bound to the earth in ways that are hard to explain. The geography of the land is as much a part of their story as the people who walk it. The jagged cliffs, the hidden caves, the deep ravines, they are all connected to the dark magic that runs through the veins of the skinwalkers and through the very heart of the mountains themselves. In the quiet moments, when the sun begins to set and the shadows stretch long across the earth, it's easy to forget the danger. The mountains seem to soften, the harsh edges blurring into the soft glow of the fading light. But as night falls, and the stars come to life, the land shifts again, and the ancient whispers return. The mountains, once again, seem to come alive. And in the distance, you might hear the howl of a coyote, or is it something else, something far more ancient and far more dangerous, stalking the slopes of the sacred mountains? There's a chill that creeps down your spine when you're alone in the desert at night, standing at the edge of a vast, endless landscape. The air is still, and the stars hang so close it feels as though they could reach down and touch you. The land beneath your feet is ancient, as old as time itself, and in the silence, something seems to stir, something unseen, yet palpable. It's the kind of silence that holds 1,000 voices, all whispering at once, waiting to be heard. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps carried by the wind, there is the faintest sound, a howl, so far and yet so close, a cry that echoes in your chest, settling deep in your bones. It's not the sound of a wolf or a coyote. It's something more, a presence, a force, a warning. And it's in these moments, when the world around you feels as though it's holding its breath, that the skinwalkers walk between worlds. The connection between skinwalkers and the spirit world is one that is difficult to grasp, as if the very essence of it is both hidden and too vast to understand. The Navajo speak of it with reverence and fear, acknowledging the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, the physical from the spiritual. Skinwalkers are said to traverse that veil, moving freely between these realms, as if they exist in a place beyond time and space. They are not bound by the same rules that govern the rest of us. They step between the worlds of men and spirits with ease, crossing over when it suits them, and returning when they please. There are stories, passed down through generations, of those who have crossed paths with skinwalkers in the wilderness, encountering beings that seem to flicker between one form and another, as though their bodies were not fully tethered to this world. They walk in human form one moment, but shift in the blink of an eye, becoming wolves, bears, or even shadowy creatures that defy description. Their eyes, however, remain the same, dark, cold, and full of a knowing that chills the soul. It's as if their gaze can pierce the veil, seeing into places that are hidden to the rest of us. This ability to move between realms, to straddle the line between life and death, is the core of the skinwalker's power. It's said that they are able to tap into the spirit world, to draw strength and knowledge from forces beyond our understanding. In the quiet moments, when the wind picks up and the earth feels alive, there is the sense that the skinwalkers are not just creatures of flesh and bone, but of spirit. Their very essence is tied to something greater, something that moves through the land and the stars. The spirit world, according to Navajo belief, is not some distant, unreachable place. It exists all around us, intertwined with the living world, and the boundaries between the two are fluid. There are places in the desert, in the high mountains, and in the sacred valleys, where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. It is here that the skinwalkers are said to draw their power, walking freely between both realms. They are not just beings of the earth, but creatures of the spirit, carrying with them the knowledge of the dead and the power of the unseen. And yet, there is a price. The skinwalkers, in their pursuit of power, have sacrificed their humanity. They have traded their souls for the ability to transcend the physical world and enter the spirit realm at will. They are cursed, forever bound to the darkness they have embraced, and while they may move freely between the living and the dead, they are not truly at peace in either world. Their connection to the spirit realm is not one of harmony, but of imbalance. They are creatures caught in between, neither fully alive nor fully dead, forever haunted by the spirits they seek to control. It is in these moments of crossing that the true danger of the skinwalkers reveals itself. They do not just inhabit the land, they are the land. They are part of the spirits that linger, part of the wind that sweeps through the desert, part of the mountains that watch over the earth. Their connection to the spirit world allows them to manipulate forces beyond human comprehension. The wind that blows, the shadows that stretch across the desert at night, these are all threads in the web of the spirit world, and the skinwalkers, with their dark powers, are able to tug on them, shaping the world around them. But with this power comes a terrifying isolation. The skinwalkers are not like the spirits of the dead who have passed on peacefully. They are twisted by their choices, condemned to walk the line between the living and the dead, never truly belonging to either. They are creatures who live in the darkness, whose connection to the spirit world has corrupted them, turning them into something far darker than human. Some say that the Skinwalkers can summon spirits from the other side, that they can call upon the dead to do their bidding. Others claim that they can possess the living, slipping into their bodies and controlling them like puppets. These stories are told in hushed tones, with fear in the eyes of those who speak them. The idea that a human being could lose control of their own body, their own mind, is a thought too terrifying to fully comprehend. And yet, for those who have encountered Skinwalkers, it is a truth they know all too well. The spirit world is not some far-off place. It is here, among us, hidden in plain sight. The Skinwalkers, those who have learned to walk between the worlds, are a reminder of that. They are proof that there is more to this world than what we can see, more to life than what we experience with our senses. The wind whispers through the trees, the shadows dance on the desert floor, and somewhere in the distance, there is the sound of a coyote's howl, a call from the other side, a reminder of the darkness that lies just beyond the veil. And as you stand there, on the edge of the desert, the night air heavy with the weight of the stories that surround you, you can't help but wonder, are we ever truly alone? Or are we always surrounded by those who walk between worlds, watching, waiting for the moment when the veil becomes too thin, and the spirit world spills over into the world we know? There are nights when the stars seem to pulse, as if they are alive, breathing in rhythm with the earth below. The air feels heavier, thick with the weight of something ancient and forgotten. Standing under the dark sky, it's impossible not to feel the vastness, the emptiness, and the undeniable pull of something beyond comprehension. In those moments, when you look up and feel the chill of the universe press against your skin, the question lingers, what if the stars are more than just distant lights? What if they are the very force that ties all things together, weaving the fates of the living, the dead, and those who walk between them? The Skinwalkers, those mysterious figures that slip in and out of the shadows, are not just beings tied to the earth. They are connected to the heavens in ways that few can understand. Their very existence seems to be caught in the cosmic web, tied to celestial forces that are as old as the stars themselves. It's as if their power is drawn from the very heavens, and the night sky holds secrets that can only be whispered to those who are brave enough, or cursed enough, to listen. Skinwalkers are said to have the ability to shift between forms, to become animals, spirits, or even something that defies description. But there is more to this power than the simple ability to transform. The change is not just physical, it's spiritual, cosmic. They are creatures who walk not only in the world of men, but also in the realm of stars. Their connection to the celestial bodies, to the moon and the sun, to the planets that wheel through the vastness of space, shapes them in ways that most will never grasp. Their existence is a reflection of the cosmic forces that govern life and death, light and darkness. It is said that the Skinwalkers are born of a cosmic balance, of forces beyond the reach of mere mortals. They tap into the hidden energy of the universe, pulling from the power of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Some believe that the very act of transformation is an echo of celestial bodies themselves. Just as the moon waxes and wanes, so too can the Skinwalkers shift, becoming something entirely different with the rise of each new moon, drawing strength from its phases. The sun, too, is said to hold power over them. Its light can purify, but its absence in the darkness can fuel their most sinister actions. When the stars fill the sky, when the earth is bathed in darkness, the Skinwalkers' power peaks, and they are free to move in ways that are beyond human comprehension. In Navajo mythology, the night sky is often seen as a mirror of the earthly realm, and the movements of the stars are intertwined with the lives of humans. Skinwalkers, with their ability to move between realms, are thought to be in sync with these celestial rhythms. They are not just beings who are tied to the earth beneath their feet, they are creatures who seem to exist in the spaces between the stars, caught in the currents of the cosmos itself. Their existence is a dance between the physical and the spiritual, a balancing act that mirrors the very forces that drive the universe. The moon, in particular, plays a significant role in this cosmic dance. In many cultures, the moon is associated with both creation and destruction, light and dark. It is a symbol of power, mystery, and transformation. For the Skinwalkers, the moon's phases are not just cycles in the sky, they are the pulses of energy that guide their movements, that fuel their transformations. As the moon grows fuller, so too does their power. As it wanes, so too does their strength fade. And when the moon disappears entirely during a new moon, the darkness is complete, an absence that mirrors the emptiness the Skinwalkers feel as they slip into the shadows. But it's not just the moon that ties them to the stars. The very constellations themselves are believed to hold the stories of the Skinwalkers. In the night sky, the patterns of stars are seen not just as random dots of light, but as maps that tell the stories of ancient gods and heroes, of spirits that walk the earth and the heavens. Skinwalkers, in their connection to the celestial, are thought to be guided by these maps, their actions shaped by the movements of the stars and the stories they carry. The stars are not just symbols, they are living things, with their own will and power. To the Navajo, the stars are connected to the spirits of ancestors, to those who have passed on but still watch over the living. The Skinwalkers, who are both of this world and of the next, are seen as walking a fine line between these two realms. Their ability to shift between human form and animal form, their ability to travel in and out of the spirit world, is a reflection of the way the stars move between light and darkness, life and death. This cosmic connection is not without its price. The Skinwalkers' power is born of an ancient pact, one that binds them to forces far beyond their control. Just as the stars govern the heavens, so too do they govern the Skinwalkers. The stars' power is a gift, but it is also a curse. The very forces that give them strength can also destroy them, as the sky is a realm of both creation and chaos, of harmony and destruction. It is said that the Skinwalkers are bound to the stars in a way that makes them both eternal and fleeting, both powerful and vulnerable. When the Skinwalkers move, they move with the rhythm of the cosmos, as if the universe itself is their guide. Their actions are not just driven by earthly desires or needs, they are part of a greater pattern, a larger cosmic design that few can see or understand. It is in this way that their power becomes both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They are creatures not just of the earth, but of the heavens, moving between the two with ease, shaping the world around them according to the will of the stars. As you stand beneath the night sky, the stars twinkling above, it's impossible not to wonder, are we truly alone in this vast, endless universe? Or are there those who walk between worlds, guided by forces that we cannot see, creatures who are connected to the stars in ways that we may never fully comprehend? The stars are silent, but their stories are written in the sky, waiting for those with the courage to look up and listen. And somewhere, out there in the darkness, the Skinwalkers move, just as the stars do, between the realms of the living and the dead, weaving their own story into the vast, cosmic tapestry of existence. It's said that some stories are so powerful, they stay with you forever, etched in your bones, woven into the fabric of your thoughts. In the darkness of a quiet night, when the wind howls through the trees, you might feel it, a cold shiver that crawls across your skin, a whisper that echoes through your mind. You hear it, but you don't understand it. Not yet. But when you do, you'll remember the warnings, the lessons, the fear. The Skinwalker myth carries with it a legacy of fear, but it's not just fear for fear's sake. It's a lesson, one handed down from generation to generation, carried by the ancestors like an unbroken thread. The legacy of the Skinwalker is more than just tales of terrifying creatures, it's a reminder of the power of caution, of respect, and the consequences of breaking sacred bonds. The stories speak of a world that is not always as it seems, a world where danger lurks just beyond the veil of what we understand. In the deep of night, when shadows stretch long across the land, the stories come alive. The Skinwalkers are not just figments of imagination, they are warnings wrapped in the guise of myth. They represent the danger of straying too far from the sacred, of tampering with forces that should never be disturbed. The people are told to heed these stories, to listen carefully, to understand the cost of disrespecting what is ancient and unknown. There are moments when the wind carries a whisper, a warning, a cautionary tale carried from the lips of those who have come before. The elders speak of the consequences of straying from the path, of breaking sacred rules. When you hear the Skinwalker's name, there is a sense of gravity, a weight that settles into your chest. It's not just a name. It's a reminder. A reminder that certain things should never be sought, never be tempted. Once you hear the stories, once you understand what they mean, it becomes impossible to look at the world the same way. There's a story told about a young boy, so eager to prove himself, so hungry for power, that he ventured out one night, alone, deep into the hills where the shadows grow long. He didn't believe the stories. He didn't think the warnings were meant for him. But the darkness is thick, and there are things in the night that watch, that wait. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The wind, which had once seemed so innocent, now carried an echo of something else. The chill, once refreshing, now felt like the icy fingers of something beyond the human world. He was never seen again, swallowed by the very force he had been warned about, a victim of his own curiosity. The elders speak of him in hushed tones, a warning for the young ones, a cautionary tale that sticks with you long after you hear it. It's not just about fear, it's about understanding the boundaries of the world around you. The skinwalker represents the consequences of overstepping. The myth serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when respect is lost. It's about knowing where to draw the line, and understanding that some things should never be touched. The stories of the skinwalker have lived for generations, passed down through the ages, not to frighten, but to teach. They speak of a delicate balance between the physical and spiritual worlds, a balance that can be disturbed with just one wrong step. The skinwalker, a being that can move freely between these realms, is a creature born from that imbalance, a warning of what happens when that harmony is broken. It's about understanding the consequences of choices, about recognizing the power of respect and reverence for the unseen forces that shape the world. In the quiet corners of the night, as the wind whips through the trees, you might hear the voices of the past calling out. Not just the voices of those who are gone, but the voices of the lessons they left behind. The fear that skinwalkers invoke is not a simple fear of the unknown. It's a fear of the unknown consequences, of what might happen if you stray too far from the path, of what might happen if you forget the lessons of those who have come before. And there are times when the fear is not just a feeling, but an instinct. The skinwalkers don't just live in the dark corners of your mind. They live in the stories that have been handed down, in the warnings whispered in the night. They are a reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most are the things we should respect the most. The myths are not just stories, they are guides. They are the lessons that keep us grounded, the markers that remind us where we stand in a world that can seem chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous. The legacy of fear carried by the skinwalker myth is not just about terror. It's about respect. It's about understanding that there are forces in the world that we can never truly understand. And when you understand that, when you internalize the truth behind the stories, the world takes on a new shape. You begin to see things differently, your steps become more careful, your eyes more aware. You know that there are things you cannot control, and that some things should never be disturbed. It's the fear of breaking boundaries. It's the fear of disrespecting the old ways. And above all, it's the fear of what happens when we forget the wisdom of those who came before us. The skinwalker is not just a creature of darkness, it is a symbol of all the things that are too dangerous to meddle with, of the unseen powers that govern our world in ways we cannot understand. And as long as we remember the lessons, as long as we honor the past, the darkness will remain at bay. In the end, it's not the skinwalker you should fear. It's the consequences of ignoring the stories, of forgetting the lessons that have been passed down. When you forget that, the darkness will find you. And just like the young boy who wandered too far, you might find that some things are better left alone. The fear is not there to terrify, it's there to teach. To remind you that the world is bigger than you think, and there are things you don't fully understand. It's a legacy, passed down from the past, wrapped in a myth that will never fade. There's a place where stories are not simply told, they're felt. A place where the words seem to linger in the air, heavy with meaning, waiting to take root in the hearts of the young. A child sits by the fire, eyes wide as the elder speaks in the hushed, steady rhythm of a voice that has carried these stories for generations. The wind howls outside, but inside, in the circle of family and community, there is warmth. There is history. There is a connection that goes beyond just hearing words, it's an inheritance. The children sit at their elders' feet, learning the stories of their people, stories that have shaped their understanding of the world for centuries. They listen intently, their minds open to the weight these words carry. Stories of strength, of wisdom, of magic, and of fear. Of skinwalkers who stalk the night, of powerful spirits that exist just beyond the veil of the world they know. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They are the very foundation of who they are. They teach lessons. They shape lives. And they are passed on, not in the classroom, but in the living, breathing moments of everyday life. In the quiet moments, when the sun dips below the horizon and the world seems to settle into darkness, the elder speaks of the skinwalkers. Their voice is steady, but there's something in the air that shifts. A tension, a feeling of reverence. The children know this is not just a tale to scare them, it's a warning. It's a lesson about respect, about knowing the boundaries of the world and the consequences of stepping too far. They hear about the skinwalkers in the same way they hear about their ancestors, with awe, with respect, and with the understanding that these are lessons that must be learned. The stories are told in whispers, passed down from generation to generation, not just as words, but as teachings. The Navajo and Hopi children grow up surrounded by these lessons. They grow up knowing that the world is much more than what they can see. They learn to respect the earth, the spirits, and the delicate balance that ties everything together. It is through these stories that they learn about the importance of their cultural traditions, the values of respect and humility, and the dangers of arrogance and greed. The skinwalker, in all its terror, serves as a reminder to stay grounded, to never forget where they come from. There's something about these stories that sticks with the children. They don't just hear them, they feel them. They become part of them. It's like a piece of their soul understands the weight these stories carry. The skinwalker is not just a figure of fear, it's a symbol of the consequences of misusing power, of ignoring the natural order. As they grow older, the lessons become more clear. They understand that the world is full of unseen forces, and that the skinwalker represents the dark side of humanity. It is the consequence of forgetting who you are, of losing your way. In the stillness of the night, when the stars are sharp and bright above, you can hear the stories echoing through the air. Sometimes, it is the children who tell the stories, passing them down in their own words, adding their own pieces to the tapestry of their culture. Their voices are quiet, but there's a pride that runs through them, a sense of knowing that they are part of something much larger than themselves. These stories are their legacy, and they will carry them forward, just as their elders did before them. It is how they remember who they are, and it is how they ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. But the lessons are not always gentle. The children learn, too, about the dangers of straying from the path, about the importance of honoring the spirits and the land. There is a weight to the stories that makes them feel real, almost as if the very earth beneath their feet trembles with the truths contained in the tales. The skinwalkers are not just mythical creatures, they are reminders of the thin line between the human world and the supernatural. They teach the children that there are things that should never be disturbed, things that must be respected. These aren't just the teachings of the elders, they are the whispers of the wind, the rustling of the trees, the songs of the animals that speak the language of the land. As they listen to the stories, the children grow quiet. Their imaginations are alight with images of the terrifying creatures, but more than that, they understand the lessons. They understand that power, when misused, can twist the world into something unrecognizable. They understand that their ancestors, in telling these stories, are not just passing down fear, they are passing down wisdom. The skinwalker myth, with all its terror, is an essential piece of that wisdom. When a child hears the story of the skinwalker, they don't just picture a monster, they picture a lesson that will shape them for the rest of their lives. They learn to be humble, to respect the land, to listen to the elders, and to understand that there is much in this world that cannot be controlled. The skinwalkers, in all their terrifying forms, are the embodiment of everything that happens when the natural order is broken. They are a cautionary tale wrapped in the darkness of the night, a reminder of the consequences of losing sight of what is truly important. In the days that follow, the children might find themselves looking up at the sky, remembering the stories. They might feel a shiver run down their spine, a sense of the power of the unknown, and the responsibility that comes with that power. But more than anything, they will remember the lesson. The Skinwalker is not just a creature to fear. It is a teacher. It is a reminder to live with respect, to never forget the past, and to always tread carefully in a world that is far more mysterious than they can ever understand. The fire burns low as the elder finishes the tale, and the children sit in silence. The stories are a part of them now, woven into the very fabric of their lives. They know that one day, they will tell these stories to their own children, just as their parents told them. And so, the cycle continues. The lessons live on. And the legacy of those who came before remains, etched in the hearts of the young. The wind howls across the desert, stirring up dust and sand that whip against the skin. Beneath the dim, faded glow of streetlights, a young man walks, his heart pounding, his steps hurried. He's not alone, not really. The air feels thick, charged with something ancient, something that tugs at his very soul. He's heard the stories. Everyone has. Skinwalkers. The shape-shifting, shadow-haunting creatures that slip between worlds. He's heard of them all his life, but tonight they feel closer. He picks up his pace, glancing over his shoulder, but there's nothing. Just the quiet hum of the city. Yet, somehow, he knows they're out there. In a world of flashing screens and modern conveniences, how does a belief born of ancient tradition survive? The Skinwalker myth, rooted deeply in the lands of the Navajo and Hopi people, still lives on, its grip tightening even in today's bustling cities, where technology and science dominate. But it's not just fear that keeps it alive, it's something far deeper. A yearning for something more. Something real. The stories have changed over time, twisted and reshaped in the minds of those who hear them. Some say the Skinwalkers have evolved with the times, no longer simply figures that haunt remote wildernesses, but now creatures that walk in the shadows of city streets, stalking the modern world. The idea of them is no longer just a story for children, but a chilling reminder that some things, no matter how much the world changes, remain constant. Yet, for many, it's not just about the terror. It's about understanding the very nature of the world, the power and the danger that lie in the things unseen. The modern world has its own horrors, wars, pollution, injustice, but in the stories of Skinwalkers, there is a warning that the supernatural world hasn't gone anywhere. It's simply waiting, watching, biding its time. For the Navajo and Hopi, those who carry these stories in their blood, the Skinwalker belief still resonates deeply, especially in times of upheaval. The modern world may be fast-paced, but there are moments when the old ways find their place, even if it's just a whisper in the wind. There are moments when the Skinwalker myth holds up a mirror to the choices we make, to the balance we constantly upset by chasing after power, wealth, and control. The stories are more than just warnings of creatures lurking in the dark, they are symbols of the consequences of losing one's way. It's easy to dismiss ancient beliefs, to call them superstition, when one has never felt the weight of a deep, unshakable fear. But for those who carry these stories with them, the Skinwalker is not a thing of fantasy. It's an echo of something that's been passed down, generation after generation, a reminder of the spirits that walk unseen among us, waiting for the moment when they can slip through the cracks we've made in the world. You can feel it in the way the old ones speak of the Skinwalker, their voices trembling with a mix of reverence and terror. For them, it's not just a myth. It's real. It's a part of the fabric of their lives, tied to the land they walk on, to the traditions they honor. And even as the world moves faster and faster, as people forget the old ways, that connection doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting for those who are willing to listen, to see the world as it was meant to be seen. For some, the relevance of the Skinwalker myth is seen in the caution it teaches. In a world where the lines between right and wrong blur, where ambition can drive a person to do unspeakable things, the myth serves as a reminder: power has a cost. Crossing that line, letting the darkness in, comes with a price. It's a reminder that, no matter how far humanity has come, there are still forces beyond our control. The Skinwalker stands as a symbol of this, of the consequences of straying from the natural order, of forgetting that some things should never be tampered with. The young man walks faster now, the shadows seeming to stretch out ahead of him. The world is no longer full of light. Every corner feels like it could hide something, anything. The rustling of leaves, the scraping of metal, the distant howl of a dog, all of it feels somehow different, charged. He can't shake the feeling that he's being watched. And maybe he is. Maybe the stories aren't just stories. Maybe the skinwalker does exist in the cracks of the world, waiting for a moment to slip through, to remind those who think they've mastered the earth that some things are beyond our reach. Yet, despite all of this, the myth endures. It endures because it serves a purpose. The world has changed, yes, but the lessons remain timeless. As long as there is darkness in the world, as long as there is power that can be misused, the myth will remain. It will continue to scare, to warn, to remind us that there are things in this world we cannot control. Even as technology continues to grow and the world becomes more disconnected from nature, the skinwalker will always have a place, lingering in the hearts of those who still believe. In the midst of our busy lives, in the noise and chaos of modern existence, the story of the skinwalker whispers to us from the past. It calls us to remember that, no matter how far we've come, there's still something primal within us. There's still a part of us that knows the world isn't as safe as we sometimes think. It reminds us that, sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones we see on our screens or hear about in the news. Sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones that walk with us in the shadows, waiting for us to forget the lessons we were meant to learn. And so, the myth survives. It survives not just because it's a tale of fear, but because it's a tale of warning. It survives because, deep down, we all know there are things in this world we can't control, things that will always remain just beyond the light. The skinwalker is not just a myth. It is a legacy, one that lives on in the hearts of those who still remember, who still listen to the whispers carried on the wind. And perhaps, just perhaps, it will continue to endure for generations to come. The crackling of a fire fills the air, the scent of cedar and sage curling upwards into the night sky, mingling with the cool desert breeze. Around the fire sit the elders, their faces lined with the wisdom of 1,000 years. In the silence that stretches between them, there is something palpable, something sacred. The fire dances, casting flickering shadows on their faces, and for a moment, the world seems to pause. One elder, a woman whose hair is streaked with silver, stares into the flames as if they hold the answers to all things. Her voice, when she speaks, is soft, but each word carries the weight of generations. She speaks of the skinwalker, of the creatures that walk between worlds, and of the deep, unspoken fears that have been passed down through the ages. Her voice trembles, but not from fear. It trembles with the knowledge that some stories cannot be told lightly. Some truths, she knows, are too heavy to bear. It is not just the flesh that changes, she says, her eyes never leaving the fire. It is the soul. To walk as a skinwalker is to lose oneself. To give up the very essence of who you are, to trade your humanity for power. Her voice is filled with sadness, the kind that comes from knowing that there are paths in life from which there is no return. The others listen, their faces unreadable, but the weight of her words settles over the group like a heavy cloak. They know the truth of it. They have seen it, lived it, and felt it in their bones. The skinwalkers are not just monsters of myth, they are a reflection of what can happen when a person turns their back on the land, on the spirit, on the traditions that have guided their people for centuries. The skinwalker is a warning, a reflection of what becomes of those who are consumed by darkness, who lose their way. As the woman speaks, an old man, his skin like weathered leather, nods slowly. He, too, has seen the changes that have come over the land. The world is changing, he says, his voice low and gravelly. The old ways are forgotten by many. But the spirits are still here. They never left. His eyes glint with something ancient, something wise. The skinwalkers, they remind us that the balance is fragile. The balance between the physical world and the spirit world. The balance between life and death. When that balance is broken, when you take too much, when you refuse to listen, the spirits will come for you. The fire crackles, sending sparks up into the night, and the wind picks up, howling across the desert. It's as if the very earth is listening, the spirits of the land drawn close by the words of the elders. In the flickering light, the faces of the old ones appear to shimmer, as if they, too, are becoming part of the fire, part of the land, part of the stories. The woman speaks again, her voice softer now, almost as if she is speaking to herself. We are caretakers of the earth. Our ancestors taught us this. We are not meant to control it, but to live with it, to honor it. But when people forget this, when they seek power above all else, that is when the skinwalkers are born. That is when darkness takes root. The words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. There is a deep, ancient sadness in them, the kind of sadness that comes from watching the world change in ways that cannot be undone. The elders know the truth of it. Those who forget the old ways, who abandon the teachings of the ancestors, are at risk of losing their humanity. The skinwalker myth is not just a story. It is a cautionary tale. A reflection of the dangers that lie in the shadow of unchecked ambition and the forgetting of the sacred bonds between people and the land. A young man, barely more than a boy, shifts nervously in his seat. His eyes dart from elder to elder, unsure of what to say. Finally, he speaks, his voice trembling. "But, is there hope?" he asks, his voice small. "Can we change things? Can we stop it from happening?" For a long moment, no one answers. The fire crackles, the wind whispers, and the desert holds its breath. Then, the old man speaks again, his voice steady, yet filled with the weight of all the years he's lived. "There is always hope," he says. "But hope does not come without sacrifice. You must remember the teachings. You must honor the land. You must listen to the spirits. Only then can the balance be restored." The young man nods, his face a mix of fear and determination. He understands. The way forward is not easy, and it will require more than just words. It will require actions. It will require the strength to fight against the pull of darkness, to stand firm in the face of temptation, and to honor the sacred bonds that tie the people to the earth. The woman speaks once more, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "We must remember," she says, her eyes meeting each of their gazes, "that the skinwalker is not just a creature of the night. It is a warning. A reminder that we are all connected. To the earth, to the sky, to each other. When we forget this, when we lose sight of what truly matters, we risk losing ourselves." The fire flickers, and the night seems to settle around them, as if the very land is listening. The elders' words hang in the air, woven into the fabric of the world itself. There is a silence that follows, a silence filled with the weight of centuries, of wisdom passed down from those who came before. And as the fire burns low, the elders fall quiet, their faces lit by the last flickers of the flame. They do not need to say more. The young man understands now. He feels the weight of the land beneath his feet, the pull of the spirits, and the deep, unspoken truth that the skinwalker is not just a creature of fear. It is a reflection of the darkness that can take root in the human heart when we forget the sacred bond that ties us all together. In the stillness of the night, as the embers of the fire die down, the world feels both ancient and fragile, as if the very breath of the earth is holding its own, waiting. Waiting for the people to remember. Waiting for the balance to be restored. The moon hangs low in the sky, casting a pale light over the desert. The winds whisper through the sagebrush, carrying with them stories older than time itself. Beneath the glow of the moon, the landscape feels both eerily silent and alive. The shadows stretch long, twisting and writhing in the corners of your vision, like something waiting to emerge. The air is thick with the feeling of being watched, of something unseen, yet always present. In the distance, a coyote howls, its mournful cry echoing through the night. And for a moment, you wonder, could it be more than just a coyote? Could it be the skinwalker, its shape-shifting, its presence lingering at the edges of your awareness? The line between reality and myth feels thin here, as though the stories are not just stories, but a living, breathing part of the world. The mystery of the skinwalker is not simply in the fear it instills, but in the power it holds. It is a myth that cannot be easily dismissed. Its roots run deep in the land, tied to the very soul of the people who tell its tales. The Skinwalker is more than just a creature, it is a reminder of the fragility of humanity, the cost of power, and the consequences of straying too far from the path of balance. Each story told around a campfire, each whispered word in the darkness, carries with it a weight that lingers long after the flames have died down. There are those who laugh off the tales of the Skinwalker, dismissing them as superstition, but there are others, those who know the land, who understand the ancient bond between people and spirits, who do not take such stories lightly. They feel the weight of them in their bones, the unease that settles in the pit of the stomach, the fear that creeps in when the sun sets and the world grows quiet. But what is it about these myths that hold such power? Why do they persist, generation after generation, despite the changing world around them? It is not just the thrill of the unknown or the fear of the supernatural that keeps these stories alive. It is something deeper, something tied to the very essence of life itself. The Skinwalker represents a breaking point, a crossing of boundaries that should never be crossed. It is a warning of what happens when a person abandons their humanity, when they forsake the sacred bonds that tie them to the earth, the sky, and the spirits. It is a reminder that there are forces beyond our control, forces that will always seek to restore balance, even if it means exacting a heavy toll. There is a haunting beauty in the power of these myths. In a world that often feels disconnected from its roots, the stories of the Skinwalker bring us back to a time when people understood that the land was alive, that every tree, every stone, every breath of wind had a spirit. The Skinwalker is a creature of transformation, a being who defies the laws of nature, and yet it is this very defiance that makes it so terrifying. It is a symbol of the consequences of trying to wield power over what we do not understand, of trying to control the forces that govern life and death. As the moon rises higher, the air grows colder, and the shadows deepen. You find yourself standing at the edge of the darkness, feeling the pull of something unseen. The stories echo in your mind, each one more vivid than the last, and you begin to wonder, what if the Skinwalker is not just a creature of myth? What if it is something much closer, something we cannot escape no matter how hard we try? In the stillness of the night, the mystery of the Skinwalker becomes something more than just a tale of horror. It becomes a reflection of our own fears, our own desires, and our own need for control. We may tell ourselves that the Skinwalker is just a story, a way to explain the unknown, but deep down, we all know that the myth holds a mirror up to our own souls. It forces us to confront the darkness within, the parts of ourselves that we would rather not see. The elders who pass these stories down understand this truth better than anyone. They know that the Skinwalker is not just a threat from the outside world, but a warning of what can happen when we turn away from the sacred, when we seek power at any cost. Their wisdom is not just about survival, but about understanding the balance between the seen and the unseen, between the physical and the spiritual. They know that the Skinwalker is always there, lurking in the shadows, a reminder that the world is far more complex than we often allow ourselves to believe. And as the night stretches on, you can't help but feel that the myth is still alive. Even as the world changes, as technology and progress march forward, the power of these ancient stories endures. They remind us that we are not separate from the world around us, that we are tied to the land, to the spirits, and to the mysteries that dwell in the darkness. The Skinwalker is not just a figure of fear. It is a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding, forces that will always shape our lives, whether we acknowledge them or not. And perhaps that is the true power of the Skinwalker myth, its ability to tap into something primal, something universal, that resonates with all who hear it. It is a myth that will never truly fade, for it is part of the very fabric of the world, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be felt, to be experienced, and to be remembered. As the night draws to a close and the fire burns low, you find yourself with the eerie sense that something has shifted. The stories of the Skinwalker are no longer just stories, they are a part of you, a part of the world, and they will remain, always just out of reach, like shadows stretching across the land.